I inherited my father's construction company and found human remains at our latest job site. What we've discovered beneath local homes goes back decades, and the man responsible won't stop calling me. I never wanted to take over my father's construction company. Growing up, I watched how it consumed him, the endless phone calls, the stress of managing crews, the constant worry about deadlines and budgets. At family dinners, he'd stare blankly at his plate, mine still at the job site. Mom would try to engage him in conversation, but his responses were always distracted, half-formed thoughts about lumber deliveries or city inspectors. No, I wanted something different. I went to college for architecture, determined to design buildings rather than build them. I wanted to create spaces on paper, neat and clean, without the mud and sweat and danger. Then Dad had his stroke. It happened on a Tuesday in October. I was in my final semester, preparing my portfolio, when Mom called. Dad had collapsed at a job site. By the time I made it to the hospital, the doctors had already delivered their verdict: significant brain damage. He would live, but Turner Construction would die without someone to take the reins. And just like that, my carefully designed future crumbled. Mr. Turner? We've got a problem with the foundation at the Eastwick site. I looked up from my desk, Dad's desk, at Hector, our foreman. His weathered face was creased with concern. What kind of problem? I asked, trying to sound authoritative despite having been in charge for only 8 months. The soil tests came back. There's more clay than we thought, and with all the rain last month. He trailed off, shaking his head. I grabbed my hard hat. Let's go take a look. The Eastwick development was our biggest project yet, a 6-story apartment complex on East Avenue. Dad had secured the contract just before his stroke, his crowning achievement after 30 years in business. Now it was my responsibility, my potential failure. As we drove to the site, Hector filled me in on the technical details. I nodded as though I fully understood, but the truth was I was still learning. My architecture degree helped with reading blueprints, but the practical aspects of construction, the real-world complications of building, those were things I was picking up day by day, mistake by mistake. How's your father doing? Hector asked as we pulled up to the site. Better, I said. He's starting to form full sentences again. Mom says he asked about the Eastwick project yesterday. That's good. He put a lot into this one. I nodded, feeling the weight of expectation. I know. The site was a hive of activity, excavators digging, workers taking measurements, trucks delivering materials. The foundation was partially poured, but work had stopped in one section where the soil looked particularly wet. See that? Hector pointed to a dark patch. Water seeping in faster than we can pump it out. We might need to redesign this corner of the foundation. I stared at the muddy pit, calculating costs and delays. What if we... Mr. Turner? A voice called from behind us. I turned to see a man I didn't recognize walking toward us. He was in his 70s at least, with a thin frame and bright, alert eyes that contrasted with his aged appearance. He wore clean work clothes and a faded cap that might once have been blue. Yes, I responded, trying to place him. Maybe one of Dad's old contacts? Name's Malcolm Reed, he said, extending a hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. I used to work this area back in the day. Heard about your project and thought I'd stop by. Nice to meet you. Are you in construction? Was. Retired now. Started with my father's company back in '62. His eyes crinkled at the corners. We built half the houses in Millfield. Millfield? That's where I grew up. Is that right? Which house? 214 Cedar Street. Malcolm's eyes widened slightly. Well, I'll be. That was one of ours. Small world, ain't it? A strange chill ran through me despite the warm spring air. You built my childhood home? Might have. We did most of that development. He glanced at the excavation. Having foundation trouble? Hector jumped in. Clay soil's giving us grief. You know how it is with the water table in this area. Malcolm nodded sagely. Seen it before. Mind if I take a closer look? I hesitated, then nodded. He wasn't on payroll, but experience was experience. We walked to the edge of the pit, and Malcolm crouched down with surprising agility for his age. He grabbed a handful of soil, rubbing it between his fingers. Yep, this is tricky ground all right. We had a similar problem on Maple Avenue back in '78. Had to drive the piles deeper than planned. He stood up, brushing his hands clean. You're gonna need better drainage here, or you'll be fighting water forever. Hector nodded. That's what I was thinking. I looked between them, feeling like the odd man out despite being the boss. How would you approach it? Malcolm described a solution involving French drains and additional gravel layers. It made sense, and Hector was nodding along. As they discussed technical details, I found myself studying Malcolm more closely. There was something familiar about him, but I couldn't place it. You said you built houses in Millfield, I said when there was a pause in their conversation. Did you know the families who moved in? Malcolm shrugged. Some. Mostly just built and moved on to the next. Why do you ask? Just curious. I have some strange memories of that house. Oh. His eyes sharpened with interest. What kind of memories? When I was a kid, my friends and I found things buried under the houses. In the crawl spaces. Malcolm's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Kids are always finding things. Active imaginations. These weren't imaginary, I said, feeling suddenly defensive. We found work boots. Old ones, half buried in the dirt. One pair under each house in the neighborhood. Hector laughed. Probably left by the construction crews. We lose stuff on sites all the time. But Malcolm didn't laugh. He was watching me intently, his bright eyes never leaving my face. Interesting, he said finally. Very interesting. A shout from across the site broke the moment. One of the workers was waving frantically. Looks like they hit something, Hector said, already moving toward the commotion. I followed, with Malcolm trailing behind. A small crowd had gathered around one of the excavators. The machine had stopped digging, and the operator looked pale. What is it? I asked, pushing through the workers. The operator pointed into the newly dug trench. Don't know, boss. But it's not right. I peered over the edge. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing, something dark and misshapen, partially embedded in the clay soil. Then my brain processed the image, a shoe, or what remained of one, with something still inside. Is that I couldn't finish the sentence. Hector was already pulling out his phone. I'm calling the police. I turned to look for Malcolm to ask if he'd ever encountered anything like this before, but he was gone. Scanning the site, I caught a glimpse of his faded cap disappearing through the gate. The police arrived within minutes. The site was shut down, yellow tape strung across the entrance. Officers and then crime scene technicians swarmed the area, focusing on the trench where the discovery had been made. I stood off to the side, answering questions when asked but otherwise trying to stay out of the way. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a numb sense of unreality. This couldn't be happening. Not to me. Not to Dad's legacy project. Mr. Turner? A woman in plain clothes approached, showing a detective's badge. I'm Detective Reyes. I understand you're in charge here. Yes. It's my father's company, but he's not well. I'm sorry to hear that. Her tone was professional but not unkind. Can you tell me about the discovery? I recounted the morning's events, including the excavator operator's shout and what we'd seen in the trench. I don't know what it is exactly. I mean, I saw a shoe, but we've confirmed it's human remains, she said matter-of-factly. At this point, that's all I can tell you. The words hit me like a physical blow. Human remains? You mean a body? At least one, yes. She watched my reaction carefully. Do you know anything about this property's history? Just that it was vacant for years. It was some kind of warehouse before that, I think. The demolition was completed last year before we took on the project. She made a note. Have you noticed anything unusual during excavation? Prior to today, I mean. I thought about the question. No, nothing like that. Just normal construction issues. And who would have had access to the site? My crews, of course. The security company we hire for nights and weekends. Various inspectors, delivery drivers. I trailed off, realizing how many people came and went. What about former construction workers? Anyone who might have knowledge of the area? Malcolm's face flashed in my mind. There was a man here today. Said his name was Malcolm Reed. Claimed to have built houses in Millfield, where I grew up. He was helping us with the foundation issue, but he left when we found the shoe. Detective Reyes's expression sharpened. He left immediately after the discovery? Yes. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Can you describe him? I did my best, detailing Malcolm's appearance, approximate age, and what he'd told me about his construction experience. He said he started working with his father in 1962. She wrote everything down. We'll look into Mr. Reed. In the meantime, I'm afraid your site will remain closed until we complete our investigation. How long will that take? Hard to say. Could be days, could be weeks, depending on what we find. She handed me her card. If you remember anything else about Reed or notice anything unusual, call me directly. I nodded, pocketing the card. As she walked away, I turned to stare at the excavation, now surrounded by police activity. The project that was supposed to secure Turner Construction's future was now a crime scene. Dad would be devastated if he understood what was happening. One of the crime scene technicians emerged from the trench, carrying a sealed evidence bag. Through the plastic, I could see what looked like rotted leather, the remains of a work boot. My stomach turned as childhood memories flooded back. We found work boots. Old ones, half buried in the dirt. One pair under each house in the neighborhood. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The image of that decayed shoe kept appearing whenever I closed my eyes. And intertwined with it, memories of childhood discoveries that suddenly seemed far more sinister. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep altogether. I went to my home office and fired up my laptop. I started searching for information about Malcolm Reed, construction companies in Millfield during the 1960s and 70s, anything that might help me understand the connection between my childhood home and the grisly discovery at the Eastwick site. There wasn't much. A few newspaper clippings mentioned Reed Construction in relation to the Millfield development, but nothing specific about Malcolm or his father. A search for criminal cases involving construction sites yielded too many results to be useful. I needed to narrow things down. I opened a new tab and typed Missing Persons 1970s Millfield. This brought up several relevant articles. Throughout the decade, a number of young women had disappeared from the area. Most cases remained unsolved, with investigators at the time theorizing about a possible serial predator. The last noted disappearance was in 1981, after which the cases stopped. One article included photos of some of the missing women. I scrolled through them slowly, a creeping dread building in my chest. They were all young, attractive, with the distinctive fashion and hairstyles of the era. Something about their smiling faces, preserved in time while their bodies might be. I couldn't finish the thought. I was about to close the browser when a detail caught my eye. One of the women, Susan Mercer, age 22, was last seen leaving a local bar with an unidentified man described as being in his 30s, associated with the construction industry. The article, dated September 1978, went on to say that Susan had told friends she was going to see a new house being built. My hands were shaking as I picked up my phone. Despite the hour, I dialed Detective Reyes's number. "It's James Turner," I said when she answered, her voice thick with sleep. "I think I know what happened at the Eastwick site." The next morning, I met Detective Reyes at a coffee shop near the police station. She looked tired but alert, a case file on the table in front of her. "I pulled the records on those missing persons cases you mentioned," she said after I'd sat down. There were 7 disappearances between 1971 and 1981 that matched the pattern. All young women, all last seen in social settings, all vanished without a trace. And the connection to construction sites? It wasn't emphasized in most of the reports, but after your call, I took a closer look. 3 of the women were explicitly last seen with men described as construction workers. 2 others told friends they were going to see new building projects. I felt sick, and the timing coincides with the development of Millfield. She nodded. Reed Construction was involved in building most of the houses there, according to county records. The company was owned by Harold Reed. He had a son named Malcolm who worked with him. That's him, the man who showed up at my site yesterday. We're looking for him now. She hesitated. There's more. The preliminary examination of the remains found at your site indicates they belong to a young woman deceased for decades. And she paused again. They found evidence of more remains. More? How many? They're still excavating, but ground-penetrating radar suggests at least 3 distinct burial sites. The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm, too crowded. "Jesus," I whispered. I need to ask you more about the boots you mentioned finding as a child, Detective Reyes said, her voice gentle but firm. You said they were in the crawl spaces of houses in your neighborhood? I nodded. My friends and I used to play in the new houses before families moved in. You know, when they were just framed out. Then after we moved into our homes, we'd dare each other to crawl under the porches. That's where we found them. Work boots partially buried. We thought it was weird but not sinister. Did you ever tell your parents? I tried to tell my mom once, but she just thought it was kids making up stories. Dad was always working. He didn't have time for stuff like that. A thought struck me. Detective, you said the company was owned by Harold Reed. What happened to him? She consulted her notes. Died in 1985. Heart attack. And Malcolm. The company closed after Harold's death. Malcolm seems to have worked various construction jobs after that, but drops off official records around 1990. No death certificate, though. I took a deep breath. What happens now? We continue investigating. The human remains will be sent to the lab for DNA analysis. We'll try to match them with the missing persons cases. She closed her file. And we find Malcolm Reed. I spent the rest of the day in a daze. The Eastwick site remained closed, so I worked from my office, rescheduling deliveries and reassigning crews to other, smaller projects. But my mind wasn't on schedules or budgets. It was tunneling back through time, re-examining childhood memories in a horrifying new light. I remembered how my friends and I had turned the boot discoveries into a spooky game. We'd dare each other to crawl deeper under the houses, to touch the half-buried leather, to make up stories about their owners. We called it Boot Hunt, and it lasted a whole summer until Jimmy Carter's mother caught us emerging filthy from under their porch and put an end to our expeditions. Had we been playing around in makeshift graves? The thought made me gag. By evening, I couldn't stand being alone with my thoughts anymore. I drove to my parents' house, the same house I'd grown up in at 214 Cedar Street. Mom greeted me with a tired smile, and I followed her to the living room where Dad sat in his recliner, staring at a muted television. Look who's here, Robert, Mom said brightly. It's James. Dad's eyes slowly focused on me. Since the stroke, his reactions were delayed, his expressions muted. But I could still see the recognition in his gaze. James, he said, the word slightly slurred. Hi, Dad. I sat on the couch across from him. How are you feeling today? Good, he said, his standard response regardless of his actual condition. Mom excused herself to prepare dinner, leaving us alone. I wanted to ask him about Malcolm Reed, about the construction of our house, about the boots, but in his condition, complex conversations were difficult. I had to keep things simple. Dad, do you remember building the houses in this neighborhood? He shook his head. No, didn't build. Just bought. Right, you bought this house. Do you remember who built it? He frowned in concentration. Reed, he said after a moment. Harold Reed? My heart rate picked up. Did you know him well? Business, acquaintance. His hand made a dismissive gesture. Why? I chose my words carefully. I met his son, Malcolm, at the Eastwick site. Something changed in Dad's expression. A tightening around the eyes, a subtle tension. Malcolm, he repeated. Bad man. Bad how, Dad? He struggled to find the words, frustration evident as his brain failed to cooperate with his intentions. Rumors about girls. Girls who disappeared? A nod. Never proven. Did you suspect him back then? Dad's gaze drifted to the window, toward the darkening evening sky. Everyone did, but no evidence. I leaned forward. Dad, we found something at the Eastwick site. Human remains. His eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked more present than he had in months. Malcolm, he whispered. The police are looking for him. He came to the site, and then he disappeared when we found. I stopped myself, not wanting to upset him with details. Did Malcolm ever work for you? After his father's company closed? Dad shook his head firmly. Never. Wouldn't hire him. Why not? Bad feeling. About the boots. I froze. What do you mean about the boots? Dad's expression grew distant again. and I wasn't sure if he'd lost his train of thought or was remembering something painful. Found them, he said finally, under houses, like trophies. The word sent a chill through me. Trophies? You knew about the boots under the houses. A nod. After you told Mom. I checked. Saw them. He breathed deeply, the effort of extended conversation clearly taxing him. Told police, but no bodies. No proof. So the police knew? They investigated. Not enough. No warrant. The pieces were falling into place. Dad had believed the rumors about Malcolm. He'd taken my childhood stories seriously enough to look under our porch, to find the boots himself. He'd gone to the police, but without bodies, there wasn't enough evidence for a proper investigation. Does Malcolm know that you suspected him? That you went to the police? Dad nodded slowly, confronted him once, at bar. What happened? Denied everything. Said, watch your back. Dad's hand reached out, grasping my arm with surprising strength. Be careful, son. He's still out there. A chill ran down my spine. I will, Dad. Mom called us for dinner then, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. But Dad's warning echoed in my mind throughout the meal. As I drove home later that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At every red light, I checked my rearview mirror, half expecting to see Malcolm Reed's bright eyes staring back at me. The next day, I received a call from Detective Reyes. We've identified the first set of remains, she said without preamble. Susan Mercer, the woman who disappeared in 1978. I remembered the photo from the article. Young, smiling, unaware of her fate. The one who was last seen going to visit a construction site. Yes, and we've recovered 2 more bodies so far. Preliminary findings suggest they've been there for decades as well. Any sign of Malcolm Reed? Not yet, but we've circulated his description to all departments in the state. She paused. There's something else. The boots we found with each victim, they match the description of what you found as a child. My free hand clenched into a fist. So it's the same killer. He buried those women under the houses in Millfield, and then he started burying them at the Eastwick site. It looks that way. Mr. Turner, I'd like you to come to the station today. We need a formal statement about your conversation with Reed, and I want to show you some photos to confirm his identity. Of course, I'll be there this afternoon. After hanging up, I sat at my desk, staring at nothing. The company my father had built over decades was now linked to a serial killer's burial ground. If, when this hit the news, the Turner name would be forever associated with these gruesome discoveries. But that wasn't what troubled me most. It was the realization that Malcolm Reed had deliberately sought me out at the Eastwick site. He knew who I was. He mentioned building my childhood home. Was it a coincidence that we were excavating where he'd buried his victims? Or had he been watching me, watching Turner Construction, waiting for this moment? Be careful, son. He's still out there. The office phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. I answered automatically. Turner Construction. This is James. Silence on the other end. Just the faint sound of breathing. Hello? Is anyone there? I like your boots. The voice was immediately recognizable. Malcolm Reed, his tone pleasant as if we were having a normal conversation. They look just like the ones I used to wear. My blood turned to ice. Malcolm, James Turner, son of Robert. I've been watching your career with interest. The police are looking for you. A soft chuckle. I'm sure they are. But they won't find me unless I want to be found. Why are you calling me? To give you some professional advice. You should be more careful about where you dig. I gripped the phone tighter. You killed those women. You buried them at my construction site. I've buried lots of things in lots of places over the years. Your father knew that. He tried to interfere, but he couldn't prove anything. His voice hardened. And now you're following in his footsteps, digging up the past. You won't get away with this. I already have for nearly 50 years. He paused. Did you know that your house has a basement? Most people in Millfield think their houses are built on crawl spaces only. A wave of nausea hit me. What are you talking about? 214 Cedar Street. Your parents still live there, don't they? Such a lovely home, with such interesting things beneath it. If you go near my parents, you should check under the utility room. There's a false floor. Your father never found that spot during his amateur investigation. Malcolm's voice was calm, almost soothing. I'd hurry if I were you. Your mother is home alone right now, isn't she? With your father in his diminished condition. The line went dead. I was already running for the door, phone in hand, dialing 911 as I sprinted to my car. The drive to my parents' house was a blur of running red lights and swerving around slower vehicles. I kept trying to call Mom, but there was no answer. The 911 operator assured me they were sending officers to the address, but all I could think about was Malcolm Reed's calm voice describing a false floor in our utility room. I screeched to a halt in front of the house, barely taking time to turn off the engine before I was sprinting up the front walk. The door was unlocked. Mom never locked it during the day, a habit from safer times that I'd argued with her about repeatedly. Mom! I shouted, bursting into the entryway. Mom, where are you? The house was silent. I moved from room to room, calling for her, panic rising with each empty space I found. The living room where Dad usually sat in his recliner was vacant. The kitchen showed signs of interrupted activity, a cutting board with half-chopped vegetables, a pot of water on the unlit stove. Mom! Dad! My voice echoed through the house. The utility room was off the kitchen, a small space housing the water heater, furnace, and washer. I approached it with dread, pushing open the door slowly. The room was empty of people, but something was wrong. The old rag rug that had covered the center of the floor for as long as I could remember was pushed aside. Beneath it, the concrete floor had a seam running in a rectangular pattern. A trapdoor I'd never known existed. It was open, revealing a dark hole and a crude ladder leading down. I stood frozen, staring at this impossible addition to my childhood home. The sound of sirens in the distance broke my paralysis. Pulling out my phone, I turned on its flashlight and approached the opening. Mom? Dad? Are you down there? My voice sounded small and frightened, like I was a child again. No response. The beam of light showed a dirt floor about 8 feet below, but little else. I had to go down. I had to know. The ladder creaked under my weight but held. The space below was larger than I expected. Not just a crawl space, but a small room, dug out beneath the house. My light revealed rough dirt walls reinforced with wooden beams, a packed earth floor, and objects, shapes in the shadows that I couldn't immediately identify. As I swept the light around, its beam caught something reflective, eyes. I jerked back, nearly falling off the ladder, before realizing they belonged to a doll. A child's doll, old and dirty, propped against one wall. Next to it was a hairbrush with strands of dark hair still tangled in its bristles. A tarnished necklace, a woman's shoe, and partly buried in the dirt floor, the toe of a work boot. James? James? Are you in here? My mother's voice came from above, from the kitchen. Mom, I'm down here. Relief flooded through me. Where were you? I've been calling. Her face appeared at the opening, lined with concern. I was in the backyard hanging laundry. I didn't hear the phone. What are you doing down there? I didn't even know that was there. Mom, where's Dad? Is he with you? He's at physical therapy. Diane picked him up an hour ago. Mom peered down at me, confusion evident. James, what's going on? Why are the police here? The sirens I'd heard had arrived, and I could hear officers entering the house, calling out. Ma'am? This is the police. Are you all right? In here. I called out. In the utility room. Everything happened quickly after that. I climbed out of the hidden room, explaining to the officers about Malcolm's call, the threats, the discovery. Mom sat at the kitchen table, visibly shaken as I revealed the connection between our home and the bodies found at the Eastwick site. All these years, she whispered. We've been living above that. One of the officers was already on the radio requesting crime scene technicians and detectives. Another was helping Mom prepare to leave the house. It would become an active crime scene as soon as they confirmed what I'd found in the hidden room. I called Detective Reyes directly, filling her in on Malcolm's call and what I discovered. She told me to stay put until she arrived, which didn't take long. Within 30 minutes, the house was swarming with police personnel. Mom and I sat in a patrol car, watching as they set up crime scene tape around the property. How could we not have known? Mom asked, her voice hollow. All these years? I put my arm around her shoulders. There's no way you could have. The trapdoor was hidden under that rug. The rug that was always there. But the noises. Sometimes at night, I'd hear. I thought it was just the house settling. She looked at me, her eyes haunted. Do you think he came into our house while we were sleeping? To visit those things he kept down there? The thought was too horrifying to contemplate. Before I could answer, Detective Reyes approached the patrol car. Her expression was grim. We're treating the hidden room as a secondary crime scene, she said. Preliminary examination suggests the items down there are personal effects belonging to multiple victims. Trophies, I said, remembering Dad's word. She nodded. That's our current theory, yes. We'll need to process the scene thoroughly, which means your parents won't be able to return home for several days, possibly longer. They can stay with me, I said automatically. Good. Now about Malcolm Reed. The call you received came from a burner phone, but we've got a trace on the general area. We've also got officers checking all construction sites in the city, active and abandoned. He won't be easy to find, I said. He's been doing this for decades without getting caught. True, but he's never had this much heat on him before. And he made a mistake by contacting you. She fixed me with a serious look. Mr. Turner, until we locate Reed, you need to be extremely careful. We can provide protection for you and your parents. Do you think he'll come after us? I think he sees you as a threat, especially now that you've found his trophy room. People like Reed, they live in two worlds, their public face and their secret one. You've exposed his secret world. A chill ran through me. What do we do now? Now we hunt him down. And we use every resource available to make sure he never hurts anyone again. She handed me her card again. Call me anytime, day or night, if you see or hear anything suspicious. As she walked away, I looked back at my childhood home, now cordoned off with yellow tape. The place where I'd built forts out of sofa cushions, where I'd opened Christmas presents, where I'd mourned my first broken heart. All while beneath the floor, a monster's trophies lay hidden in the dark. Mom squeezed my hand. Your father was right about Malcolm. All those years ago, he suspected, but no one would listen. Malcolm mentioned confronting Dad once. She nodded slowly. I remember that. Your father came home furious. He said he'd seen Malcolm at O'Malley's bar and had accused him to his face about the missing women. Malcolm just laughed it off, but your father was convinced. She paused. That was right before your father installed extra locks on all our doors and windows. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I remembered Dad's sudden obsession with home security when I was around 10, how he'd checked the locks multiple times before bed, how he'd never let me or Mom go into the crawl space to retrieve holiday decorations or stored items. He was protecting us, I said softly. He always did. Mom looked toward the house again. And now we need to help the police finish what he started. That night, as Mom, Dad, and I sat in my living room, a family displaced, I couldn't help feeling we were being watched. Every passing headlight, every creak of the house settling made me tense. Somewhere out there, Malcolm Reed was watching, waiting, planning his next move. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. In my dreams, I saw boots half buried in dirt, heard Malcolm's calm voice on the phone, and felt the suffocating darkness of spaces beneath houses, spaces where terrible secrets lay hidden for decades, waiting to be discovered. Be careful, son. He's still out there. 3 days after discovering the hidden room beneath my childhood home, I stood in the rain watching workers seal off the Eastwick construction site. The forecast matched my mood, dark, gloomy, with no end in sight. Detective Reyes had called that morning to inform me that they'd recovered a total of 6 sets of remains from the partially completed foundation. 6 women, buried and forgotten until an excavator's blade accidentally unearthed them decades later. The media had gotten hold of the story. Local news vans idled across the street, reporters doing stand-ups with the site as a backdrop. They'd been calling my office nonstop, hungry for quotes, for gruesome details, for anything that would make their segment more sensational than their competitors. I'd stopped answering the phone entirely. Mr. Turner. I turned to find Detective Reyes approaching, an umbrella shielding her from the downpour. She looked as tired as I felt. Any news on Malcolm? I asked, though I could tell from her expression the answer was no. Not yet. He seems to have vanished. She gestured toward her car. Can we talk somewhere dry? We sat in her unmarked sedan, raindrops drumming on the roof. She handed me a file folder. What's this? Information we've gathered on Malcolm Reed. I thought you might want to see it, given your personal connection to the case. I hesitated before opening the folder. Inside was a collection of documents, old newspaper clippings, photocopied driver's license records, employment history, and a few faded photographs. One showed a much younger Malcolm, perhaps in his 30s, standing proudly in front of a newly constructed house. He wore work boots identical to the ones found buried with the victims. We've confirmed he worked on at least 5 housing developments between 1962 and 1985, Reyes explained. Millfield, where you grew up, was one of them. After his father died, he did odd construction jobs around the state. No fixed address for the past 20 years. So he could be anywhere. Potentially. But people like Reed, they have patterns. Habits. He's been operating in this general area for decades. She pointed to a map in the file showing the locations of missing persons cases potentially linked to Malcolm. We think he's still close. Why hasn't he been caught before now? All these women. I flipped through pages detailing disappearances spanning nearly 3 decades. Different jurisdictions, pre-digital record keeping, no physical evidence until now. And Reed was careful. He chose transient victims when possible, women passing through town, students from out of state, women estranged from their families. And he buried them where no one would think to look, I added, remembering the hidden room beneath my parents' house. Under new construction. Reyes nodded. The perfect hiding place. Once the house is completed, who's going to dig up a foundation or a crawl space without cause? I thought about my childhood home, how we'd lived there for decades, oblivious to what lay beneath our feet. The image made me sick. Have you found anything at my parents' house? Besides the trophies? No human remains, if that's what you're asking. But the forensic team is still processing the space. The items found there, the personal effects, they match descriptions of belongings carried by women who disappeared between 1975 and 1980. I closed the file, unable to look at the smiling faces of victims any longer. What about my father? Have you spoken with him about his previous suspicions regarding Malcolm? Yes, his communication is limited, but with your mother's help, we've pieced together that he suspected Reed back in the early 1980s after several local women went missing. He reported his concerns, but without evidence. She shrugged. Different era, different standards of investigation. And now Malcolm knows that I found his trophy room, that the police are investigating. I stared out at the rain-blurred landscape. He won't stop, will he? People with his psychology rarely do. They either escalate or relocate, meaning he might leave the area, start over somewhere else. It's possible, she conceded, but first, he may feel compelled to clean up loose ends. The implication was clear. I was a loose end, so were my parents. The protection detail on your parents will continue, Reyes assured me, reading my expression. And I've arranged for an officer to keep an eye on you as well. I nodded my thanks, though the prospect of police protection offered little comfort. Malcolm Reed had evaded detection for decades. He knew how to move unseen, how to wait for the perfect moment. And he knew exactly who I was. As if reading my thoughts, Reyes added, "We'll find him, Mr. Turner. This is the closest we've ever been. He's made mistakes now, and he'll make more." I wanted to believe her, but as I watched another news van pull up to the site, reporters eager to broadcast the story of the bodies found at the Turner construction project, I couldn't shake the feeling that Malcolm was watching too, planning, waiting. I'd insisted that my parents stay at my house until theirs was cleared as a crime scene. Mom had agreed readily, but Dad was struggling with the change in routine. His stroke had left him with a need for familiarity, for consistent surroundings. In my 3-bedroom ranch, he seemed constantly disoriented, forgetting where the bathroom was, calling for Mom from the guest room in the middle of the night. That evening, I returned home to find Mom cooking dinner while Dad napped in the recliner I'd moved from the living room to the guest room for his comfort. The television was on low, tuned to a local news channel. I reached for the remote to turn it off before they could start another segment on the Eastwick discoveries. "Leave it," Mom said from the kitchen. "I want to know what they're saying. It's just sensationalism. They don't have any facts we don't already know." Maybe so, but the whole city is talking about it. I'd rather know than wonder. I sighed but placed the remote back on the coffee table. "How's Dad today?" "Better. The physical therapist came this morning. She said his left side is showing improvement." Mom stirred something on the stove. "He asked about the house again. What did you tell him?" "The truth. That we can't go back yet because the police are investigating." She wiped her hands on a dish towel. "I didn't tell him that I never want to set foot in that house again." I moved to the kitchen island, lowering my voice though Dad was unlikely to hear us from the other room. "We could sell it, once this is all over. Buy something new." "With what money, James? Your father's medical bills have eaten through most of our savings. And now with the Eastwick project shut down, the financial reality of our situation wasn't something I wanted to think about. But Mom was right. Turner Construction was on thin ice. The Eastwick development had been our biggest contract. Our financial lifeline after Dad's stroke had forced me to step in unprepared. Now it was a crime scene, and our name was attached to a macabre discovery that dominated local headlines. "We'll figure something out," I said, with more confidence than I felt. "Maybe we can get insurance to cover some of the delays at Eastwick. And there are other projects in the pipeline." Mom gave me a sad smile. "You sound just like your father, always the optimist when it comes to business." She turned back to her cooking. Detective Reyes called earlier. She wanted to know if I remembered any young women who might have visited the Reed construction sites when our house was being built. Apparently, they're trying to match missing persons from that time with the items found under our house. "Did you remember anyone?" "No. I was pregnant with you when we bought the house. I wasn't paying attention to who was at the construction site." She looked up suddenly. "But Marion might know." Marion Delahant. She lived next door to us for years before moving to Florida. She was always watching out her window, keeping tabs on the neighborhood. Nothing happened on Cedar Street that Marion didn't notice. I vaguely remembered Mrs. Delahant, an older woman with cat-eye glasses who would peer through her curtains whenever my friends and I played in the street. "Do you still have her contact information?" "I think so. We exchange Christmas cards." Mom set down her spoon and went to find her address book. On the television, the news had shifted to a different story. A local business owner celebrating 50 years in operation. I was about to turn it off when the business owner's face appeared on screen, and I froze. It wasn't Malcolm Reed, but there was something in the elderly man's expression, in the way he smiled at the camera, that reminded me of Malcolm. The same confident charm, the same bright eyes that seemed to hold secrets. What was it Malcolm had said on the phone? I've buried lots of things in lots of places over the years. A terrible thought occurred to me. What if the Eastwick site and my parents' house weren't the only places he'd used? What if there were other sites, other houses with similar secrets buried beneath them? Mom returned with a slip of paper. Here's Marion's number in Tampa. I doubt she's still up at this hour, but you could try in the morning. I took the paper, my mind still racing with implications. Mom, did Dad ever mention other construction sites where he suspected Malcolm might have done the same thing? She thought for a moment. Not specifically, but I remember him saying once that anywhere the Reeds built, there might be problems. And they built all over the city for decades. The enormity of it hit me like a physical blow. How many houses? How many victims? How had no one connected the dots before now? But someone had tried. My father. And he'd been dismissed. His concerns filed away without proper investigation. Now, decades later, the truth was finally emerging. Too late for the women whose remains we'd found, but maybe not too late to prevent more deaths. I needed to talk to Detective Reyes again. I pulled out my phone, but before I could dial her number, Dad called out from the guest room, his voice slurred but urgent. "James? That you?" "I'll check on him," Mom said, but I waved her back to the stove. "I've got it." Dad was sitting up in the recliner, more alert than I'd seen him in days. The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp and the flickering blue light of the television I'd set up for him. "Hey, Dad, how are you feeling?" His eyes fixed on mine with surprising clarity. He was here. A chill ran down my spine. Who was here? Malcolm. Dad's good hand gripped the armrest. Saw him. Outside. I moved to the window, pulling back the curtain to peer into the gathering darkness of early evening. The street was quiet, empty except for the police cruiser parked across the road. The protection detail Reyes had arranged. "There's no one out there, Dad. Just the police officer watching the house." Dad shook his head stubbornly. He was there, looking in. I sat on the edge of the bed next to his recliner. "When did you see him?" "Before you came home, standing by the tree." I looked out the window again. There was indeed a large oak near the edge of my property, its branches casting long shadows in the fading light. Could someone stand there and observe the house without being noticed by the officer in the cruiser? "Dad, are you sure it was Malcolm? It's been a long time since you've seen him." "Know his face," Dad insisted. "Never forget." I pulled out my phone and called the officer outside. He answered promptly, and I explained my father's claim about seeing someone by the tree. "I've been watching the house and street continuously, sir," the officer said. "Haven't seen anyone approaching or loitering in the area, but I can take a walk around the property if it would make you feel better." "Please do, and keep an eye on that oak tree on the west side." After hanging up, I turned back to Dad. "The officer is going to check it out, but he says he hasn't seen anyone." Dad's expression remained troubled. "Malcolm's smart, careful." He tapped his temple with his good hand. "Watches. Waits. I know, Dad. The police are looking for him. Not enough." His frustration at his limited speech was evident. "Need to dig." "Dig? You mean at the construction sites?" He nodded vigorously. "All of them. Where Reed built." "The police are investigating, Dad. They're going to check other sites connected to Malcolm." But even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. Would they really dig up the foundations of dozens, maybe hundreds of houses based on what we'd found so far? The resources required would be enormous, the disruption to homeowners significant. Without specific evidence pointing to particular houses, would they even have legal grounds for such searches? Dad seemed to read my doubts. Not enough, he repeated. Need proof. What kind of proof? He struggled to find the words, his hand making a writing motion in the air. Records? I guessed. Construction records? Another vigorous nod. City permits. Work orders. Of course. If we could identify every site where Malcolm had worked, especially those where he'd been involved in foundation work, we might be able to narrow down potential burial locations. It wouldn't prove anything by itself, but it could guide the investigation. That's a good idea, Dad. I'll tell Detective Reyes. He gripped my arm suddenly. Be careful. Malcolm knows you. I will, Dad. Don't worry. But as I left the room, I couldn't help glancing out the window again, searching the shadows beneath the oak tree. Had Malcolm really been there, watching my house, watching my family? Or was it just the confused imagination of my stroke-addled father? Either way, the sense of being watched, of being hunted, was growing stronger by the hour. The next morning, I called Marian Delahint before heading to the office. Despite the early hour, she answered on the second ring, her voice exactly as I remembered it, sharp, slightly nasal, with the faint remnant of a Boston accent. Marian, this is James Turner. Robert and Helen's son? From Cedar Street? James? Of course I remember you. Always riding that red bicycle too fast up and down the sidewalk. She chuckled. How are your parents? I heard about your father's stroke. Such a shame. They're doing okay considering. Actually, that's sort of why I'm calling. The police are investigating something that happened during the construction of our neighborhood, and I thought you might remember some details. Police investigation? What on earth about? I hesitated, unsure how much to share. They're looking into some irregularities with the construction company that built the houses on Cedar Street. Reed Construction? Do you remember them? Oh my, yes. Harold Reed and that son of his. Quite the pair. Her tone had cooled noticeably. You didn't like them? Harold was a businessman. Not particularly friendly, but professional enough. The son, though. She clicked her tongue disapprovingly. Always watching the young women in the neighborhood. Made my skin crawl the way he'd look at them. My pulse quickened. Did you ever see him with any young women? Maybe ones who didn't live in the neighborhood. A pause. Now that you mention it, yes. There was a girl, I never knew her name, who would sometimes meet him at houses under construction. Pretty thing, long dark hair. This would have been, summer of '77, I believe. Before any families had moved in. The development was still being built. Did you ever tell anyone about seeing them together? Who would I tell? And for what reason? It wasn't my business who he spent time with. She sounded defensive now. Why are you asking about this, James? What kind of irregularities are the police investigating? I sidestepped the question. Did you ever notice anything strange during the construction? Or after we all moved in? Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. There was one thing. I never told anyone because it seemed like I must have been mistaken. What was it, Marian? One night, very late, I saw Malcolm Reed carrying something from one of the unfinished houses to his truck. It was wrapped in what looked like a tarp or plastic sheeting. Heavy from the way he was struggling with it. I watched from my bedroom window. This was after Frank and I had moved in, but several houses were still being constructed. What did you think it was? Building materials, I told myself. But it was so late after midnight, and he was alone working by flashlight. It just seemed odd. She took a breath. The next day, that house had a poured foundation where there had just been an open pit the day before. They moved so quickly on it, I remember thinking they must have worked through the night. My skin prickled with goosebumps. Which house was this? The Pattisons. 220 Cedar Street, 2 doors down from you. I made a mental note to tell Detective Reyes. Did you ever see Malcolm doing anything else unusual? Maybe around our house or others in the neighborhood? Not that I recall. But James, you still haven't told me what this is about. Has something happened? I chose my words carefully. The police have found evidence that Malcolm Reed may have been involved in some criminal activity during the construction of those houses. I can't say more than that right now. Criminal activity? You don't mean? Her voice trailed off as understanding dawned. Oh my God, those missing girls back then. The ones in the newspaper. Is that what this is about? I really can't comment on an ongoing investigation, Marion. It is, isn't it? And you're calling because your parents' house, all our houses, they were built by the Reeds. Her voice had risen with alarm. James, what did they find? Marion, please. I've already said more than I should. But if you remember anything else, anything at all about Malcolm Reed or unusual activities during construction, please call Detective Elena Reyes. I gave her the number. She's leading the investigation. After hanging up, I sat in my car, processing what Marion had told me. The Pattison's house, 220 Cedar Street, just 2 doors down from my childhood home. How many other houses in that neighborhood concealed similar secrets? And how many other neighborhoods? I drove to my office, my mind churning with grim possibilities. The only silver lining to this nightmare was that Malcolm himself seemed to have gone to ground, at least temporarily. Despite Dad's claim of seeing him outside my house, there had been no confirmed sightings since he'd fled the Eastwick site. But that temporary reprieve ended the moment I walked into my office. On my desk, perfectly centered on the blotter, was a pair of work boots. New ones, still bearing price tags. And a handwritten note, for when you follow in your father's footsteps. The police arrived within minutes of my call. My office was soon swarming with officers dusting for fingerprints, photographing the boots and note, and searching for any other evidence Malcolm might have left behind. Detective Reyes stood beside me, her expression grim. When were you last in your office? Yesterday afternoon. I left around 5:30. And the cleaning staff? They come in at night, usually around 9 o'clock. We'll need to interview them and check for security footage. I shook my head. There aren't any cameras in the building. It's an old place, and with the business struggling lately. I trailed off, embarrassed by the admission. Reyes made a note. What about the exterior? Street cameras, neighboring businesses? There's a bank across the street. They might have cameras covering the sidewalk. She nodded and dispatched an officer to check. Then she turned her attention back to the boots on my desk. This is a direct threat. He's escalating. He was in my office, I said, still struggling to process it. He could have been waiting for me. But he wasn't. He left a message instead. She studied the note again. For when you follow in your father's footsteps. What do you think he means by that? My father suspected him years ago. Confronted him. Went to the police. I ran a hand through my hair. And now I'm doing the same thing. There's more to it, I think. The boots are significant to him. They're part of his ritual, his signature. And now he's giving you a pair. The implication turned my stomach. You think he's inviting me to be like him? To join him somehow? Possibly. Or it could be a taunt. Either way, this confirms what we've suspected. You're a primary focus for him now. She fixed me with a serious look. Mr. Turner, I strongly recommend you stay with friends or family outside the area until we apprehend Reed. I can't leave. My parents are here, the business is here. And my father. I thought of Dad's determination to find proof of Malcolm's crimes. His frustration at being limited by his condition. Dad's been trying to warn people about Malcolm for decades. I can't walk away now. Then we need to increase your protection. And your parents. I nodded, though I wondered how effective any protection would be against someone who could slip into my locked office and leave a gift without being seen. As the police finished processing the scene, I called the office manager and told her to give everyone the day off. There was no point trying to work normally with the place crawling with law enforcement. Then I made a second call to the county records office. If Dad was right about tracking Malcolm through construction permits and work orders, I needed to start digging. The clerk who answered was initially hesitant about pulling decades-old records, but became more cooperative when I mentioned Detective Reyes and the ongoing investigation. She agreed to gather what they had on Reed Construction's projects from the 1960s through the 1980s. It'll take some time, she warned. A lot of the older records aren't digitized. That's fine. Just call me when they're ready. As I hung up, Reyes approached, looking marginally more optimistic. The bank across the street does have exterior cameras. They're pulling the footage for us now. Good. Maybe we'll get lucky. In the meantime, I want an officer with you at all times. No arguments. She nodded toward a uniformed policeman standing by the door. Officer Blake will stay with you today. We'll arrange shifts to maintain coverage. I wanted to protest the babysitting, but the boots sitting in an evidence bag were a stark reminder of how vulnerable I was. Thank you. I appreciate it. Where are you headed now? County records. I'm trying to track down all of Reed Construction's projects, like my dad suggested. If we can identify the sites Malcolm worked on, especially where he did foundation work, we might find more victims, she finished grimly. Good thinking. I'll assign someone from the department to help with that research. I'd also like to talk to some of the original investigators who dealt with the missing persons cases. The ones my father reported his suspicions to back in the 80s. Reyes hesitated. Most of them are retired now if they're still alive, and they may not remember details from cases that old. But it's worth trying, isn't it? Maybe someone remembers something that didn't make it into the official reports. Something about Malcolm that could help us find him now. I'll see what I can do. She checked her watch. I need to get back to the station. We're coordinating with departments in neighboring counties, putting together a task force to handle this investigation. The press conference is at 2 o'clock. Press conference? We're going public with Reed as a person of interest in multiple disappearances. We'll release his photo, ask for the public's help in locating him. She must have seen the alarm on my face, because she added, "We're not mentioning you or your family specifically, just that we want to question him in connection with remains found at the Eastwick site." I nodded, though the idea of a media frenzy made me uneasy. What about the hidden room at my parents' house? Are you going to release that information too? Not yet. We're still processing evidence from there. She put a hand on my shoulder. Try not to worry. With the whole city on alert, Reed will find it much harder to move around undetected. But as she left, I couldn't help thinking that the press conference might have the opposite effect. If Malcolm felt cornered, he might lash out. And I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly who his target would be. The county records office was housed in a bland government building downtown. Officer Blake accompanied me inside, maintaining a respectful distance but keeping me in sight at all times. The clerk I'd spoken to on the phone, a middle-aged woman named Doris, greeted us with the weary efficiency of a long-time civil servant. "I've pulled what we have on Reed Construction," she said, leading us to a small research room. "But I should warn you, the records are incomplete. There was a flood in the basement archive in '92 that damaged a lot of the older files. What we have turned out to be 4 bankers' boxes filled with yellowed paperwork, building permits, work orders, inspection certificates, and correspondence with various city departments. Is there any particular order to these?" I asked, eyeing the daunting stack. "Chronological, more or less. The first box starts in the early '60s when the company was founded." She gestured to a microfilm reader in the corner. "Some of the larger blueprints and site plans are on microfilm over there. I've pulled the relevant reels for you." I thanked her, and she left us to our task. Officer Blake positioned himself by the door while I began sorting through the first box, looking for any mentions of Malcolm Reed specifically. The work was tedious and dusty. Most of the documents dealt with mundane aspects of construction, permits for electrical work, plumbing inspections, certificates of occupancy. Harold Reed's signature appeared frequently, but Malcolm's was rarer, typically on work orders or daily logs rather than official paperwork. By lunchtime, I'd worked through the first box and part of the second, creating a timeline of Reed Construction's projects. They had indeed been prolific, building not just in Millfield but in a half-dozen other developments around the city over 2 decades. I was about to suggest to Officer Blake that we take a break when my phone rang. It was Detective Reyes. "We've got something from the bank's security footage," she said without preamble. A man matching Malcolm Reed's description was recorded approaching your office building at 2:17 a.m. The quality isn't great, but the height and build are consistent. Did the cameras show him leaving? No. The bank's cameras only cover the Main Street approach. Once he turned down the side alley toward your building's rear entrance, he was out of frame. So we know he was there, but not for how long or when he left. Exactly, but this confirms he's still in the area, still focused on you. Have you found anything useful in the county records? I summarized what I discovered so far about Reed Construction's projects. I'm starting to put together a list of sites where Malcolm was specifically involved in foundation work. It's slow going, though. Keep at it. Any lead could be crucial. And James? The press conference is in an hour. After that, Reed's face will be all over the local news. If he's still in the area, he'll have a harder time moving around unnoticed. Or he might get desperate, I countered. Do something rash. A brief silence. That's a possibility we've considered, which is why we have officers with you and your parents. Just stay vigilant. After hanging up, I returned to the boxes, now working with renewed urgency. Officer Blake sensed my shift in mood and offered to help, taking a stack of documents to review at a nearby table. We worked in silence for another hour before I came across something interesting. A series of internal memos from 1978 regarding a project in Lakewood Heights, a development about 20 miles outside the city. What caught my attention was a note in Harold Reed's handwriting expressing concern about M's unconventional foundation approach and questioning whether it met building codes. I set it aside for further examination and continued digging. The next significant find came from a box of records from the early 1980s, a letter from the city's building inspector to Harold Reed, referencing complaints about irregularities in several Reed construction projects. The letter mentioned specific addresses in 3 different neighborhoods, including one on Cedar Street in Millfield, my parents' block. Officer Blake, I called. I think I found something important. He joined me at the table and I showed him the letter. These addresses, they could be houses where Malcolm tampered with the foundations, maybe to create hidden spaces like the one under my parents' house. Blake studied the letter. It says the complaints were investigated and dismissed. No code violations found. But what if the inspectors didn't know what to look for, or didn't look hard enough? I pulled out my phone. I'm going to call Detective Reyes about this. Before I could dial, however, the door to the research room opened, and Doris, the clerk, stuck her head in. Mr. Turner, there's someone here asking for you. Says he has information about Reed Construction. I exchanged glances with Officer Blake, who immediately tensed, one hand moving to rest on his holstered weapon. Did they give a name? I asked. Yes, a Mr. Whitaker. William Whitaker. Says he used to work for the Reeds back in the 70s. Blake stepped forward. I'll check it out first. Stay here, Mr. Turner. I nodded and Blake followed Doris out to the front desk. Through the glass panel in the door, I could see them approach an elderly man leaning on a cane, definitely not Malcolm Reed. After a brief conversation and what appeared to be an ID check, Blake waved me over. William Whitaker was in his late 70s, with the weathered hands and stooped posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime in physical labor. He extended one of those gnarled hands as I approached. You must be Robert Turner's boy. I recognized the resemblance. You knew my father? Not well, but yes. I worked as a foreman for Reed Construction from 72 to 78. I saw the news about Malcolm and those poor women they found at your site. He shook his head sadly. Can't say I'm surprised, honestly. There was always something off about that boy. Blake interrupted. Sir, why don't we move this conversation somewhere more private? We returned to the research room where Whitaker settled heavily into a chair, his cane propped against the table. I've been following the news, he said. When they showed Malcolm's picture asking for information, well, I felt I had to come forward. I've carried this weight for too long. Wait, Mr. Whitaker?" I asked, leaning forward. He took a deep breath. "Back in '78, I caught Malcolm doing something strange at a job site. It was late, well after everyone else had gone home. I'd forgotten my thermos and came back to get it." He paused, eyes distant with memory. He was in one of the foundation trenches, digging a kind of hollow in the sidewall. When he saw me, he claimed he was fixing an issue with the soil stability. But I'd been in construction long enough to know that what he was doing wouldn't help with soil stability. "What did you think he was doing?" At the time, I wasn't sure. It just seemed odd. But he was the boss's son, so I didn't push it. Whitaker's fingers drummed nervously on the table. A few weeks later, a young woman went missing. Her picture was in the paper and I recognized her. I'd seen her at the site talking to Malcolm. "Did you tell anyone?" I told Harold. He didn't take it well. Accused me of trying to cause trouble. Fired me on the spot. Whitaker's voice hardened. 2 weeks later, they poured the foundation at that house. The spot where Malcolm had been digging was covered in concrete. I felt a chill despite the stuffy warmth of the room. "Do you remember the address of that house?" 1450 Lakewood Drive, in the Lakewood Heights development. He tapped the table with a gnarled finger. I never forgot it. Sometimes I drive by, even now, and wonder. Blake, who had been taking notes, looked up. "Mr. Whitaker, would you be willing to make a formal statement to the detective in charge of this investigation? That's why I'm here. I should have spoken up years ago, but without proof, who would have believed me? Just the word of a fired employee against the son of a respected builder." He looked at me with rheumy eyes. "I'm sorry for what happened to those women. And I'm sorry for what your family is going through now." I nodded, finding it difficult to speak past the lump in my throat. Blake stepped out to call Detective Reyes, leaving me alone with Whitaker. "Your father," Whitaker said after a moment of silence. "He suspected something too, didn't he?" "Yes. He tried to report it, but like you said, without proof. Malcolm was clever, and Harold protected him whether he knew the full truth or not." Whitaker sighed heavily. "Some fathers will do anything for their sons, even turn a blind eye to the darkest sins." "Do you think Harold knew?" "About the women?" Whitaker considered the question. "I don't think he knew at first. But toward the end, before he died? Yes, I think he had his suspicions. There were rumors among the crew about strange noises at night, about Malcolm's odd hours. Harold must have wondered what his son was really doing when he claimed to be working late. But he never reported his suspicions? Harold was a proud man, and reconstruction was his life's work." Whitaker shook his head slowly. "I think he chose to protect the company name, to protect his legacy. Even if that meant—" He trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. "Even if that meant allowing Malcolm to continue killing." Blake returned, announcing that Detective Reyes was on her way to take Whitaker's formal statement. While we waited, I showed Whitaker the letter I'd found from the building inspector about the irregularities in several Reed projects. "Do you recognize any of these addresses?" I asked. He squinted at the paper, then nodded. "This one in Westfield, I worked on that house. And yes, Malcolm was involved in the foundation work there too." He tapped another address. "This one as well, though I was off that job by the time they poured the concrete. So all these addresses could be potential sites." "It's possible." Whitaker's expression was grim. "Malcolm had a system, you see. He'd volunteer for foundation work whenever he could, especially in phases when other workers weren't around much, early mornings, late evenings. Said he preferred working when it was quiet. The pieces were fitting together with horrifying clarity. Malcolm had used his position in his father's company to create the perfect hiding places for his victims. And later, when working solo jobs after his father's death, he'd continued the practice whenever the opportunity arose. The Eastwick development where we'd found the 6 women had likely been his most recent burial ground. "Mr. Whitaker," I said, struck by a new thought, "do you have any idea where Malcolm might go now? Any places that were special to him where he might hide?" The old man considered this. There was an old hunting cabin his father owned, up near Lake Merritt. Malcolm would go there sometimes on weekends. I only know about it because he once asked me to help him fix the roof after a storm. "Lake Merritt," I repeated, committing it to memory. "Do you know exactly where on the lake?" "The North Shore, I think. Isolated spot, no neighbors for at least a mile in any direction. Perfect for someone who values privacy." The way he said privacy made it clear what he thought Malcolm had really valued about the isolation. Detective Reyes arrived shortly after, and I let her take over the questioning while I returned to the records. With Whitaker's insights, I now had a better idea what to look for: jobs where Malcolm had been specifically involved in foundation work, especially in isolated phases of construction. By the time Reyes finished with Whitaker and joined me, I'd compiled a list of 15 addresses that matched the pattern. She added them to her notes, her expression growing more troubled with each addition. "This is bigger than we initially thought," she said quietly. "If he's been active since the early 70s, and if even half of these sites contain remains, he could be one of the most prolific serial killers in the country," I finished. "And no one knew." "Someone knew," she corrected, glancing toward the door where Whitaker had departed. "People suspected. They just couldn't or wouldn't connect the dots." "So what happens now? Are you going to investigate all these sites?" "We'll start with the ones that have the strongest connection to Malcolm specifically, like the Lakewood Heights address Whitaker mentioned. Ground-penetrating radar can help us identify anomalies in the foundations without tearing up people's homes." She ran a hand through her hair, a rare gesture of frustration. "But it's going to take time. And resources we don't really have. What about the hunting cabin? Shouldn't you send someone to check it out?" "I already dispatched a team. But according to county records, the property was sold after Harold Reed's death. It's changed hands several times since then. So it's another dead end." "Maybe not. If Malcolm still views it as a safe place, he might return there regardless of who officially owns it now. Especially if it's as isolated as Whitaker claims." She stood up, gathering her notes. "I need to get back to the station. The press conference should be starting soon, and then we'll be fielding calls from the public." I began packing up the documents I'd flagged for further review. "I'd like to keep looking through these records. There might be more connections we're missing." "That's fine, but I want you to come to the station afterward. After the press conference, it's not safe for you to be moving around the city even with Officer Blake. We can set up a workspace for you there." I agreed, though the thought of being effectively confined to the police station was frustrating. As Reyes left, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom, watching the news. "When will you be home?" "Dad's worried." I replied that I'd be home later than expected and would explain everything then. As I hit send, another text came through, this one from an unknown number. "Nice work at the county records. You're getting warmer. But time is running out." My blood ran cold. I showed the message to Officer Blake, who immediately stepped into the hallway to call it in. I remained in the research room, staring at the phone as if it might bite me. How did Malcolm know where I was? How did he get my number? When Blake returned, his expression was grim. "Detective Reyes wants us to return to the station immediately. They're tracing the number, but it's likely a burner phone. He knows I'm here, Blake. He knows what I'm doing." The reality of being stalked by a serial killer was finally hitting me full force. He could be watching us right now. All the more reason to get to the station. "It's the safest place for you." We quickly gathered the most important documents, and Blake escorted me to his patrol car in the parking lot, his eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. As we drove toward the police station, the radio announced a breaking news bulletin. The press conference had started, and Malcolm Reed's face was now being broadcast across the city, along with details of the investigation and a warning that he should be considered dangerous. I stared out the window at the passing city streets, wondering if Malcolm was watching the same broadcast somewhere, planning his next move. The cat-and-mouse game had escalated, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were playing by his rules. The police station was a hive of activity. The press conference had generated dozens of calls from the public, most reporting Malcolm Reed sightings that required follow-up. Detective Reyes had set up a temporary workspace for me in a small conference room where I continued reviewing the county records I'd brought from the archives. "We've got officers checking the Lakewood Heights address," Reyes informed me during a brief visit to the conference room. "And teams are en route to the old hunting cabin site, though the current owners say they haven't seen anyone matching Reed's description." "What about the text I received?" "The number traces to a prepaid phone purchased with cash at a convenience store 2 days ago. We're checking security footage from the store, but without much hope." She sat down across from me. "James, I need to ask you something directly. Is there any particular reason why Malcolm seems so focused on you specifically? Beyond the fact that you discovered the remains at your construction site. I considered the question. He mentioned my father during our initial conversation at the site. And later, on the phone, he talked about my father trying to interfere years ago. I think this is personal for him, a grudge against my family that goes back decades. And now you're following in your father's footsteps, as his note said. Reyes tapped her pen against her notepad. He sees you as continuing what your father started, the investigation that could finally expose him. But why now? Why didn't he go after my father years ago when Dad first suspected him? Your father didn't have evidence. You do. She gestured to the documents spread across the table. And you found his trophy room. You've brought more attention to him in the past week than anyone has in 40 years. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily on my shoulders. I wasn't just investigating Malcolm's crimes, I had become a central figure in his twisted narrative, a character in the story he was writing with blood and buried bodies. The protection detail on your parents has been doubled, Reyes continued, and I've arranged for an officer to stay inside your home when you return. But James, you need to understand the level of risk here. Malcolm Reed has nothing to lose. He's evaded capture for decades, but now his face is on every news channel, his name connected to multiple murders. You think he'll try to run? That would be the rational choice. But people like Reed don't always act rationally, especially when cornered. She fixed me with a serious look. He might decide to eliminate the threat before disappearing. Or take me with him, I said quietly, thinking of the boots he'd left on my desk. Make me his final victim. Reyes didn't contradict me. Instead, she pushed a button on her phone. Send in Harris. A moment later, a uniformed officer entered the conference room. James, this is Officer Harris. He'll be staying at your house tonight, along with the officers already assigned to the exterior watch. I nodded my thanks, though the additional protection did little to ease my growing dread. If Malcolm was as careful and patient as he appeared to be, he would find a way past any security measures if he was determined enough. Reyes seemed to read my thoughts. We're doing everything we can. But I need you to be vigilant too. No unnecessary risks, no solo excursions, no deviations from established security protocols. I understand. Good. Now, have you found anything else in those records? I showed her several more suspicious job sites I'd identified, places where Malcolm had been specifically involved in foundation work, often working alone during odd hours. She added them to her growing list of locations to investigate. One more thing, I said. Marion Delahant, my parents' former neighbor, mentioned seeing Malcolm removing something heavy wrapped in plastic from a house under construction one night. The next day, the foundation was poured. That house was 220 Cedar Street, the Pattersons. We'll add it to the list for ground-penetrating radar surveys. She stood to leave. It's getting late. You should head home soon. Officer Harris will drive you. After she left, I spent another hour reviewing the remaining documents, but exhaustion was setting in. The emotional and physical toll of the past few days was catching up to me. Eventually, I gathered my notes and let Officer Harris escort me to his patrol car. The drive to my house was silent. I stared out the window at the darkening city, wondering how many homes we passed contained Malcolm's grisly secrets. How many families lived their lives just feet above hidden horrors, completely unaware. When we arrived at my house, I was relieved to see the police cruiser still stationed out front and another unmarked car that presumably contained additional officers. Mom greeted me at the door, her face tight with worry. We've been watching the news, she said, ushering me inside. That man's face is everywhere. And they're saying he might have killed dozens of women. They're still investigating, Mom. But yes, it looks that way. And he's the one who built her house. Who buried those things under the utility room. She shuddered. How did we not know? How did we live there all those years and not sense something? There's no way you could have known, I said, echoing what I'd told her days before. But the reassurance felt hollow now, knowing how extensive Malcolm's crimes appeared to be. Officer Harris introduced himself to Mom and did a quick sweep of the house before setting up in the living room, where he'd have a view of both the front door and the hallway leading to the bedrooms. I checked on Dad, who was already asleep in the guest room, then joined Mom in the kitchen. I made soup, she said, gesturing to a pot on the stove. You should eat something. I wasn't hungry, but I accepted a bowl to please her. As we sat at the kitchen table, the television in the living room continued to broadcast updates about the investigation. Malcolm's face appeared regularly alongside warnings not to approach him if spotted. Your father was right about him, Mom said quietly. All those years ago, he tried to tell people, but no one would listen. People are listening now. Too late for all those women. She stared into her soup. What's happening with your company? With the Eastwick project? The question caught me off guard. With everything else happening, I'd barely thought about Turner Construction in the past few days. It's on hold indefinitely. The site is still technically a crime scene. And your other projects? They're continuing, but... I hesitated. Mom, the company's in trouble. The Eastwick contract was keeping us afloat after Dad's medical bills and the slowdown last year. Without it and with all this negative publicity. I didn't need to finish the thought. Your father built the company from nothing, she said, her voice strengthening. It survived recessions, market crashes, and your father's stroke. It will survive this too. I wished I shared her confidence, but the reality was stark. Turner Construction might well become another casualty of Malcolm Reed's crimes, not through direct violence, but through the taint of association. No one would want to build on ground where bodies had been discovered, ground prepared by a company now linked to a serial killer. After dinner, I retreated to my bedroom, exhaustion pulling at me. I showered, trying to wash away the mental grime of the day, then collapsed onto my bed. Despite my fatigue, sleep proved elusive. Every creak of the house, every distant car passing outside jolted me back to alertness. Eventually, I drifted into a fitful sleep, only to be wrenched awake by a loud crash from somewhere in the house. I sat bolt upright, heart hammering. A shout, then the sound of breaking glass. I fumbled for my phone, ready to call 911, when my bedroom door burst open. Officer Harris stood there, weapon drawn. Stay down, he ordered, his voice tense. Someone's trying to break in through the back door. I could hear radio chatter as the officers outside responded to the intrusion. More crashing sounds came from the kitchen, followed by a splintering noise that could only be the back door giving way. Get down on the floor, Harris commanded, moving toward the hallway. And stay here. I slid to the floor beside the bed, clutching my phone. From somewhere in the house, I heard Mom cry out, followed by a thud and more breaking glass. Then a gunshot rang out, impossibly loud in the confined space of the house. Silence fell, broken only by the urgent voices of officers on their radios. I remained frozen by the bed, terrified to move. After what seemed like an eternity, Harris reappeared at my door. Clear, he said, his expression grim. But your mother's been hurt. I bolted past him, racing toward the sound of voices in the living room. Mom was on the couch, an officer pressing a cloth to her forehead where a nasty gash was bleeding freely. Dad was awake in his wheelchair, looking disoriented but unharmed. What happened? I demanded. Mom, are you okay? I'm fine, she insisted, though she looked pale and shaken. Just a cut. I fell when I heard the glass break. The officer attending her looked up. The wound isn't deep, but she'll need stitches. Ambulance is on the way. I turned to Harris. Was it him? Was it Malcolm? We don't know yet. Someone broke through the rear kitchen window, but they fled when Officer Ramirez confronted them. Ramirez fired a warning shot, but the suspect disappeared into the woods behind your property. Did anyone see who it was? Only a glimpse. Male, medium build, moving fast. We've got officers searching the area now, but... He gestured toward the darkness outside. It's a big area, lots of cover. I moved to the kitchen to survey the damage. The window above the sink was shattered, glass covering the counter and floor. The back door showed splintering around the lock, but had held. On the kitchen table, illuminated by the harsh overhead light, was a small object that hadn't been there before. A miniature work boot carved from wood. I called Harris over, pointing to it without touching it. He immediately radioed for evidence collection, then ushered me back to the living room. The paramedics arrived to treat Mom's injury, confirming that she needed stitches but was otherwise unharmed. As they prepared to transport her to the hospital, she gripped my hand. Stay with your father, she said firmly. I'll be fine. It's just a few stitches. I'll have an officer accompany you to the hospital, Harris assured her. And another will stay here with Mr. Turner and his father. I looked at Dad, who was watching the activity with unusual alertness in his eyes. He met my gaze and nodded slightly as if to say he understood what was happening. Once Mom had been taken to the ambulance, I knelt beside his wheelchair. "Dad, did you see anything? Did you hear anything before the window broke?" He shook his head, frustration evident as he struggled to form words. "Sleeping. Then, noise." He pointed toward the kitchen, then made a braking motion with his hands. "That's right. Someone broke the window." "Malcolm," he said, the name perfectly clear despite his usual speech difficulties. "We don't know for sure yet," I said, though in my heart I had no doubt. "But you're safe now. We all are." He gripped my arm with surprising strength. "Be careful. He won't stop." "I know, Dad. The police are doing everything they can." His eyes, so often clouded with confusion since the stroke, were sharp with fear and determination. Not enough. As the night wore on, more officers arrived to process the scene. The wooden boot was carefully photographed and collected as evidence. The kitchen window was temporarily covered with plywood, and additional officers were stationed around the property's perimeter. Detective Reyes arrived around 3 a.m., looking as though she'd been dragged from bed. I briefed her on what had happened while she examined the broken window and splintered door. "The carved boot is definitely his signature," she said. "He's escalating from threats to actual attempts at entry. He could have killed us all if he'd gotten inside. That may not have been his goal." "Not yet." She rubbed her eyes tiredly. "Reed is methodical. This feels more like a message. A demonstration of his ability to get close despite our precautions." "Well, message received," I said bitterly. "What now?" "Now we move you all to a safe house. This location is compromised. I've already made the arrangements." "A safe house? For how long?" "Until we apprehend Reed." Her tone left no room for argument. "Pack what you need for at least a week. We leave in 30 minutes. As I moved to comply, a disturbing thought occurred to me. "Detective, how did Malcolm know where to find us?" "The address isn't in my name. I bought this house through an LLC for privacy after Dad's medical information was leaked to the press last year." Reyes frowned. "That's a good question. He shouldn't have been able to connect you to this address through public records. So either he's been following me or someone gave him the information," she finished. "Someone who knows where you live." The implication hung in the air between us. Could there be a leak within the department? Someone feeding information to Malcolm? "Pack quickly," Reyes said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "The fewer people who know your next location, the better." Within the hour, Dad and I were being escorted to an unmarked police van, our essential belongings hastily packed in duffel bags. The safe house, Reyes explained, was a property seized in a drug case, its location known only to a select few officers. Mom would be brought there after her treatment at the hospital. As we drove through the pre-dawn darkness, I stared out the window at the sleeping city. Somewhere out there, Malcolm Reed was watching, waiting, planning his next move. The wooden boot was a message, a promise that this wasn't over, that he could reach us whenever he chose. The game of cat and mouse continued, with my family caught in the middle. And despite all the police protection, all the precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that Malcolm was still several steps ahead of us, orchestrating events according to some twisted plan only he understood. The safe house was a modest ranch-style home in a quiet suburban neighborhood about 30 miles outside the city. Unmarked police vehicles were stationed at both ends of the street, and the house itself had been fitted with additional security measures, reinforced doors, window alarms, and a direct line to the nearest police station. Dad and I were settled in by early morning. A nurse arrived to help with his care, and Mom joined us a few hours later, her forehead sporting a neat row of stitches but her spirit unbroken. The attack seemed to have awoken something in her, a determination that matched Dad's, a refusal to be victimized any further. "This has gone on long enough," she declared as she unpacked the few items she'd brought. "That man has taken enough from us, our home, our peace of mind. He's not taking anything more." I nodded, admiring her resolve while worrying about her safety. Malcolm had demonstrated his ability to find us once. What would prevent him from doing so again? Detective Reyes visited mid-morning with an update on the investigation. The search of the woods behind my house had yielded nothing, but forensic technicians had recovered partial fingerprints from the wooden boot that matched those found on the boots left in my office. It's definitely Reed, she confirmed. And we've made progress on some of the locations you identified from the county records. Ground-penetrating radar at the Lakewood Heights address showed anomalies consistent with disturbed soil beneath the foundation. Bodies? I asked, keeping my voice low to avoid upsetting Mom, who was helping Dad with breakfast in the kitchen. We believe so. We're obtaining warrants to excavate. She handed me a tablet displaying a news article. And there's this. The headline read, "Serial Killer's Lair? Police search remote cabin near Lake Merritt." The article detailed how officers had discovered an abandoned cabin that appeared to have been recently occupied, with evidence suggesting it might have been used by Malcolm Reed. The hunting cabin Whitaker mentioned? Yes. It was officially sold after Harold Reed's death, but the current owners use it only sporadically as a vacation property. They haven't visited in months. Reyes scrolled to show photos of the cabin's interior. We found items that suggest Reed has been staying there periodically: men's clothing, food wrappers, a kerosene heater that's been used recently. Was there any evidence of victims? Nothing definitive yet, but cadaver dogs indicated possible human remains on the property. We're conducting a methodical search. Hope flared for the first time in days. So you're close to finding him? We have leads, but Reed has proven adept at staying one step ahead. He clearly abandoned the cabin before we arrived, probably after the press conference put his face on every news outlet in the state. She closed the article. But his options are narrowing. Every day we learn more about his movements, his patterns, his hiding places. And every day he gets more desperate, I pointed out. More dangerous. Which is why you're here, under protection. She glanced toward the kitchen, where my parents were now sitting at the table. I need to speak with all of you about security protocols for the coming days. We gathered in the living room as Reyes outlined the measures in place, the officers on rotation outside, the alarm systems, the procedures for visitors. Only pre-approved personnel with proper identification would be allowed entry. She emphasized that none of us should leave the house under any circumstances. What about my company? I asked. Turner Construction can't just shut down indefinitely. Your office manager has things under control for now, Reyes assured me. And you can work remotely as needed. But your physical safety takes precedence over business concerns. Mom spoke up then, her voice steady. How long do you expect this to continue, Detective? We can't live in hiding forever. Not forever, Mrs. Turner. But until Reed is apprehended, this is the safest option. We're following multiple promising leads, and with each passing hour, the net tightens around him. Dad, who had been unusually quiet during the briefing, suddenly spoke with surprising clarity. He won't be caught, unless he wants to be. All eyes turned to him, startled by both the utterance and the insight it contained. What do you mean, Dad? I asked. He struggled for a moment, frustration evident as his mind raced ahead of his ability to articulate. Malcolm playing a game. Always was. Reyes leaned forward. Mr. Turner, are you saying Reed is deliberately engaging with us? With the investigation? A nod. Likes the attention. The fear. Dad pointed to his own chest. Wants us to know it's him. Wants recognition. Dad thinks Malcolm wants credit for his crimes, I translated, seeing Reyes's thoughtful expression. That he's not really trying to escape, but to be acknowledged for what he's done. That's consistent with certain types of killers, Reyes admitted. They view their crimes as achievements, as works of art. They want recognition for their accomplishments. She addressed Dad directly. Mr. Turner, do you believe Reed will try to make contact again? To continue this game? Dad nodded emphatically. Personal now. Won't stop until finished. Finished how? Mom asked, her voice tight with worry. Dad looked at me, his meaning clear even without words. Until finished with me. I was the final piece in Malcolm's twisted puzzle, the son of the man who had first suspected him, now actively uncovering his crimes. In Malcolm's mind, I represented both a threat and an opportunity, a chance to complete his decades-long campaign of terror with a grand finale. We won't let that happen, Reyes said firmly following our exchange. Reed is one man on the run with limited resources. We have an entire department plus assistance from state and federal agencies focused on finding him. But as she left, promising to return with any developments, I couldn't shake Dad's words from my mind. Malcolm was playing a game, a game with rules only he understood, a game he had been playing for decades without being caught. And I was now the central piece on his board. That night, as my parents slept and officers maintained their vigil outside, I sat in the darkened living room, Malcolm's threat echoing in my mind, for when you follow in your father's footsteps. The boots he'd left on my desk. The wooden miniature left during the break-in attempt. The work boots found with each victim and those discovered in the crawl spaces of the Millfield houses when I was a child. They weren't just signature items or trophies, they were symbols of Malcolm's twisted legacy. A legacy he apparently wanted me to inherit or become part of. I must have dozed off on the couch because the next thing I knew, I was jerked awake by the sound of my phone vibrating on the coffee table. The display showed an unknown number, and for a moment I hesitated, remembering the last text from an unknown sender. But curiosity won out. I picked up the phone and opened the message. It contained only a photo, a picture of the safe house taken from outside, showing the very room I was sitting in. The timestamp on the image read 3:17 a.m. 7 minutes ago. My heart stopped as I stared at the phone screen. The image showed our safe house from outside, with me clearly visible through the window, sitting on the couch. The photo had been taken just minutes ago. I lunged to my feet, phone clutched in my trembling hand, and rushed to the window. The street outside appeared empty, peaceful in the dead of night. The unmarked police car was still stationed at the curb, an officer presumably inside, watching. But someone had been out there, close enough to take a clear photo without being detected. Malcolm. I grabbed my shoes and rushed to the front door where an officer named Davis was stationed inside. Someone's outside, I gasped, showing him the photo. They just sent this to my phone. Davis's hand immediately went to his weapon as he examined the image. He keyed his radio, alerting the officers outside, then positioned himself between me and the door. "Stay back," he ordered, voice tense. "Get your parents to the back bedroom and stay there until I give the all-clear." I hurried to the guest room, waking Mom and Dad with urgent whispers. Mom helped Dad into his wheelchair while I explained what was happening. Despite her obvious fear, Mom remained calm, maneuvering Dad's chair toward the master bedroom at the rear of the house. I followed, closing the door behind us and positioning myself in front of them. Through the closed door, we could hear radio chatter as officers coordinated a search of the property. Minutes stretched like hours as we waited, straining to hear any sign of confrontation, any indication that Malcolm had been found. Finally, a knock at the bedroom door. "Mr. Turner? It's Officer Davis. We've secured the perimeter. No sign of anyone on the property." I opened the door cautiously. Davis stood there, his expression grim. "We've checked the entire property and surrounding area. Whoever took that photo is gone." "How is that possible? There are officers watching the house." Sergeant Mills was in the patrol car out front. "He swears no one approached the house from that direction. The backyard is fenced, but someone could have come through a neighboring yard." Davis ran a hand over his close-cropped hair. "We're expanding the search now, checking with neighbors." Detective Reyes arrived 30 minutes later, her hair hastily pulled back, eyes alert despite the hour. She viewed the photo on my phone, her expression darkening. "How did he get this number?" she asked. "It's not your regular cell, is it?" "No, it's a new one. The department issued it to me yesterday after the break-in at my house." Her eyes narrowed. "A department-issued phone. That information was restricted to a small circle of officers." The implication hung in the air. Either Malcolm had somehow accessed confidential police information or someone inside the department had provided it to him. "I want a complete review of everyone who had access to this safe house location and Mr. Turner's temporary phone number," Reyes ordered, addressing the senior officer present. "And I want the phone company tracking the source of this message." She turned to me. "We're moving you again." "Now?" "Again? Where?" "Somewhere more secure. A location known only to me and 2 other officers I personally trust." She glanced at my parents, who were listening from the bedroom doorway. "Pack only essentials. We leave in 15 minutes." As we hurriedly gathered our belongings, I couldn't shake the feeling of being herded, manipulated like pieces on a chessboard. Was that Malcolm's plan? To keep us off balance, constantly moving, watching over our shoulders? Dad seemed to share my thoughts. As I helped him into his jacket, he murmured, "Playing with us." "I know, Dad. I checked that his medication was packed. But we don't have much choice right now. Need to end it. On our terms. I paused, studying his face. In his eyes, I saw the same determination I'd felt growing in myself, a refusal to remain passive, to be perpetual victims in Malcolm's sick game. But before I could respond, Reyes called that it was time to go. The new safe house was a former state police substation, a small, bunker-like building with reinforced doors and windows. It sat isolated at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by open fields that would make any approach visible. The location, Reyes explained, had been decommissioned years ago but was still occasionally used for sensitive operations. No neighbors to observe comings and goings, she said as we carried our meager belongings inside. And the security systems were upgraded recently. The interior was Spartan, basic living quarters, a small kitchen, institutional furniture. Not comfortable, but defensible. The kind of place where you could see anyone coming. Only 4 people know you're here, Reyes assured us. Myself, Officer Blake, Captain Morales, and the security technician who updated the systems last month. No one else. What about communication? I asked, noting the lack of television or internet connectivity. Secure landline for emergencies only. No cell service by design. She handed me an old-fashioned flip phone. This is a department satellite phone for emergency use. It can't be tracked like a normal cell. Mom looked around the austere space, her expression resigned. How long will we be here? Hopefully not long. We've narrowed down Reed's possible locations significantly. The search at Lake Merritt is continuing, and we've begun limited excavation at the Lakewood Heights site. Reyes checked her watch. I need to get back, but Officers Blake and Morris will remain on site. I'll return tomorrow with updates. After she left, we settled into an uneasy routine. Mom helped Dad with his exercises, I paced the perimeter, and we all pretended not to be listening for every sound, watching for any sign of Malcolm's presence. The hours crawled by. With no internet or television, there was little to distract us from our situation. I found a stack of old playing cards in a drawer and taught Dad some simple card games that didn't require much speaking. His coordination was improving daily, and the focused activity seemed to help his concentration. Your father was always good at cards, Mom remarked, watching us from the small kitchen where she was preparing lunch from the supplies Reyes had brought. He used to win every poker night with his work friends. Dad smiled at the memory, a rare moment of lightness in our tense circumstances. Counted cards, he admitted with a mischievous glint in his eyes. Robert Turner. You always told me you were just lucky. Mom's mock outrage made us all laugh, a strange sound in our fortress-like surroundings. But the momentary levity couldn't dispel the underlying dread. As afternoon faded into evening, I found myself drawn repeatedly to the windows, scanning the open fields around the building. Officer Blake noticed my vigilance. Nothing's getting past us this time, Mr. Turner, he assured me. Clear sight lines in all directions, motion sensors at the perimeter, reinforced entry points. Malcolm's been doing this for decades, I replied. Staying hidden, planning, waiting for the perfect moment. He's patient. Even the most patient predator makes mistakes eventually, Blake said. Especially when they're being hunted themselves. That night, I slept fitfully on a narrow cot in what had once been an interview room. My dreams were fragmented, disturbing visions of half-buried boots in dark soil, of Malcolm's weathered face watching me from shadows, of foundations being poured over silent victims. I woke repeatedly, each time checking the small, high window for any sign of dawn. During one such awakening, I heard low voices from the main room. Slipping quietly from my cot, I moved to the door, which I'd left slightly ajar. Officer Blake was speaking with Officer Morris, both keeping their voices down to avoid waking us. Another set of remains at the Lakewood site, Blake was saying. That makes 4 locations confirmed now. Jesus, Morris muttered. How many women did this guy kill? Reyes thinks the total could be over 20. Maybe more we'll never find. And no sign of Reed himself? Not yet. But they found something at the cabin by the lake. Some kind of journal or ledger. Reyes is bringing it when she comes tomorrow. Thinks Turner might be able to make sense of it. I retreated silently to my cot, their conversation replaying in my mind. A journal. Records of Malcolm's activities, perhaps. Or something else entirely. Whatever it was, Detective Reyes thought it was important enough to bring directly to me rather than simply relaying its contents. Morning came with leaden skies threatening rain. Mom prepared a simple breakfast from our limited supplies while Dad watched from his wheelchair, occasionally offering quiet directions that she pretended to follow. Their domestic rhythm, preserved even in these extraordinary circumstances, was strangely comforting. Officer Morris left briefly to scout the perimeter, reporting back that all was clear. We settled into a holding pattern, waiting for Reyes to arrive with news and, I hoped, the journal found at the cabin. She arrived mid-morning, accompanied by heavy rainfall that drummed on the building's metal roof. Her expression as she entered was difficult to read, a mixture of professional detachment and something else. Anticipation, perhaps, or concern. "We've made significant progress," she announced without preamble, setting her waterproof bag on the table. "Ground-penetrating radar has identified anomalies at 7 of the 15 locations you flagged from the county records. We've begun controlled excavation at 3 sites so far, with positive identification of human remains at each." "How many victims?" I asked quietly, mindful of Mom's presence in the kitchen doorway. 11 confirmed so far. The medical examiner is working to identify them, but given the time frame, it's challenging. She pulled a folder from her bag. "We've also identified 3 more missing women from the 1970s who matched the victim profile and were last seen in areas where reed construction was active." Dad, who had wheeled himself closer to listen, spoke with surprising clarity. "Always knew it was him. No one believed." Reyes acknowledged him with a respectful nod. "You were right, Mr. Turner, and your insights have been invaluable to this investigation." She turned back to the bag, removing a plastic evidence pouch containing a weathered leather-bound book. "This is what I really wanted to show you. We found it hidden in the cabin by Lake Merritt." She laid the book on the table and carefully opened the evidence pouch. The journal inside was well-worn, its pages yellowed with age. Donning latex gloves, she gently opened it to reveal neat, precise handwriting filling the pages. "It appears to be a record of reed construction projects," she explained, "but with additional notations that don't relate to construction." I leaned closer, studying the open page. It listed an address I recognized from the county records, a house in Westfield built in 1976. Beneath the address were technical notes about foundation depth and soil conditions, but also a separate entry in different colored ink. LM 24, brunette. Talkative. Blue coat. November 14th, 76. My blood ran cold. "These are his victims," I whispered. He recorded them along with the construction details. Reyes nodded. "That's our working theory. The entries go back to 1971 and continue through 1985, when reed construction closed after Harold Reed's death. Then there's a gap until 1990, when a new series of entries begins, listing solo projects Malcolm worked on as an independent contractor." "How many entries are there? How many victims?" 28 distinct entries that appear to reference individuals. Some include only initials, others have more details. She turned several pages, revealing more addresses, more names, more dates. "The most recent entry is from just 4 months ago." "The Eastwick site," I guessed. "Yes. Though interestingly, that entry is different from the others." She flipped to the final pages of the journal, where the neat handwriting had become more erratic, the entries more elaborate. The final page contained not just an address and name, but what appeared to be a rambling paragraph that continued onto the margins. "Eastwick Development. Foundation pour scheduled April 12th. JD now running his father's company. Like father, like son? Time to complete the collection." The circle closes where it began. I stared at my initials on the page, a wave of nausea washing over me. He was planning this. Planning to target me. "It appears so." Reyes's voice was gentle but firm. "James, these last entries suggest Reed has been fixated on your family for years, possibly decades. The references become increasingly frequent after your father's stroke, when you took over the company." Dad wheeled himself closer, peering at the journal with intense concentration. Where it began, he read slowly, his finger hovering above the final line. "Millfield." Mom joined us at the table, her face pale but composed. "What does that mean?" "Where it began." I think, I said, the pieces falling into place with horrifying clarity. He's referring to his first victim, the beginning of his collection. Reyes nodded. That's our interpretation as well. And if the circle closes where it began, he may be planning to return to the site of his first killing. Millfield, Dad repeated more insistently. Our house. A heavy silence fell as the implication sank in. Malcolm's obsession had come full circle from the neighborhood where he'd begun his decades of terror to the son of the man who had first suspected him. Detective, Mom said suddenly, you said you found this journal at the cabin. Was there any sign of Malcolm himself? No, he appears to have abandoned the location days ago, likely after the press conference put his face on every news outlet. Reyes closed the journal carefully. But this gives us valuable insight into his patterns, his thinking, and potentially his next move. If he's returning to Millfield, I said, thinking aloud, to my parents' house specifically, that might explain why he's been so focused on me. On us. We've maintained surveillance on your parents' property since it was cleared as a crime scene, Reyes assured us. No one has approached the house. Dad made a dismissive gesture. Underground, he said, struggling to form the words. Hidden entrance. We all turned to him. Dad, what do you mean? A hidden entrance to the house. He nodded vigorously, frustration evident as he fought to explain. Under utility room. Not just room. Tunnel. A tunnel? Reyes leaned forward. Mr. Turner, are you saying there's a tunnel leading to the hidden room beneath your house? Another nod. Suspected. Never found it. I felt a chill run through me as I remembered the hidden room with its grisly collection of trophies. If there's a tunnel, Malcolm could access the house without being seen by officers watching the property. Reyes was already on her feet, phone in hand. I need to alert the surveillance team immediately and dispatch additional officers to search the surrounding area. She stepped away to make the call, leaving us to absorb this new revelation. Dad, why didn't you mention this before? I asked quietly. He struggled visibly, his damaged brain fighting to express complex thoughts. Not sure. Just theory. Malcolm careful? Smart. Mom placed her hand over his. Robert believed Malcolm might have created a way to access the spaces beneath houses without being detected. He mentioned it once, years ago, but without evidence. She trailed off, the implication clear. Like his other suspicions about Malcolm, this one had been dismissed as speculation. Reyes returned, her expression tense. I've ordered a full sweep of the property, including ground-penetrating radar, to check for any tunnels or underground structures. In the meantime, we're maintaining our current security protocols here. The rest of the day passed in a haze of nervous anticipation. Reyes left with the journal, promising to return with any developments from the search at my parents' house. Officer Blake maintained his vigilant watch while Morris patrolled the perimeter regularly, reporting nothing unusual in the open fields surrounding our temporary fortress. Evening brought a violent thunderstorm, lightning splitting the sky and thunder rattling the building's metal roof. The power flickered but held, the backup generator humming reassuringly in the background. Mom prepared dinner from our dwindling supplies, and we ate mostly in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. After dinner, as I helped Dad with his evening medication, he gripped my arm with surprising strength. James, he said, his voice clearer than I'd heard in months, need to finish this. End it. The police are doing everything they can, Dad. They'll find him. He shook his head firmly. Too smart. Too patient. His eyes, bright with determination, locked onto mine. Lure him. To us. Lure him? Dad, that's too dangerous. Only way. His grip tightened. He wants you. The final piece. I stared at him, chilled by both his clarity and the truth of his words. Malcolm had been playing a long game, collecting his victims, building his hidden legacy beneath the foundations of houses across the city. And now he wanted to complete that legacy with me, the son of the man who had nearly exposed him decades ago. How would we even do that? I asked, lowering my voice to prevent Mom from overhearing from the kitchen. We're isolated here, under protection. Dad smiled thinly. Press. Announcement. Going home. You want us to publicly announce that we're returning to your house? To draw him out. A nod. With police waiting. The plan was simple, audacious, and terrifying. Use ourselves as bait to draw Malcolm out of hiding. Force him to make a move on our terms with law enforcement prepared. I don't know, Dad. It's risky. And Detective Reyes would never agree to put us in danger deliberately. Not asking her. His expression turned crafty, reminding me of the shrewd businessman he'd been before his stroke. Our choice. Our fight. Before I could respond, Officer Blake called from the main room. Mr. Turner? There's something you should see. I helped Dad into his wheelchair and pushed him to where Blake stood by the window, peering out into the storm-lashed darkness. What is it? The motion sensors at the perimeter just triggered, but I don't see anything out there. He pointed to a small monitor showing a simplified layout of the property with a blinking red light at the northwestern corner. Could be an animal, but with this weather. I joined him at the window, straining to see through the rain and darkness. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the open field, but I saw nothing unusual. Maybe a deer? Or the wind blowing something across the sensor? Maybe. Blake didn't sound convinced. Morris is checking it now. As if summoned by his name, Officer Morris's voice crackled over the radio. Blake, you seeing anything on the monitor? I'm at the northwest corner, but visibility's near zero with this rain. Blake keyed his radio. Negative. Sensors still showing an alert, but no visual confirmation from here. Another flash of lightning, and this time I caught a glimpse of Morris's figure near the perimeter fence, rain slicker gleaming briefly in the electric light. He was moving slowly, weapon drawn, scanning the area methodically. Wait, Blake said suddenly, leaning closer to the window. What's that? I followed his gaze, but saw only darkness until the next lightning strike. Then I saw it too, a shape moving behind Morris, something or someone approaching from the direction opposite to where he was looking. Morris! Blake shouted into the radio. Behind you. But the warning was lost in a tremendous crack of thunder. On the monitor, a second sensor began blinking, this one closer to the building. Blake drew his weapon. Get back to the secure room, he ordered, all professional comm now. All of you. Lock the door and don't open it for anyone but me or Detective Reyes. I hurried to help Dad back toward the room where Mom was already waiting, alerted by the commotion. We barely made it halfway across the main area when the lights went out, plunging us into total darkness. The backup generator should have kicked in immediately, but it remained silent. In the pitch black, I heard Blake moving toward the door, his footsteps deliberate. Stay where you are, he called to us. The generator should restart any second. But it didn't. Instead, we heard a heavy thud against the exterior door, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Get to the secure room now, Blake shouted, his voice tight with urgency. I could see nothing, but heard him moving to position himself between us and the entrance. I groped blindly for Dad's wheelchair, finding the handles and pushing him forward while calling for Mom to follow my voice. We had nearly reached the hallway leading to the secure room when a deafening crash announced the exterior door giving way. Cold, rain-soaked air rushed in, along with the beam of a powerful flashlight that swept the room, momentarily blinding me. I heard Blake shout a warning, followed by 2 gunshots that were shockingly loud in the confined space. The flashlight beam dropped, and for a moment I thought Blake had hit the intruder. Then the beam rose again, steadier now, and advanced into the room. Blake fired once more, but the shot went wide as a second beam appeared from a different angle, catching him in its light. Police officer, drop your weapon, Blake shouted, but his voice held an edge of uncertainty now, his confidence shaken by the coordinated approach of the 2 intruders. A voice responded from the darkness, calm, measured, hauntingly familiar. I'm afraid I can't do that, officer. I've come too far to turn back now. Malcolm Reed stepped fully into the room, his figure illuminated by his own flashlight. He was soaking wet, rainwater dripping from his coat, but his movements were precise, controlled. In one hand he held the flashlight. In the other, a revolver pointed steadily at Blake. Mr. Turner, he called, as casually as if we were meeting at a construction site. I believe we have unfinished business to discuss. Blake fired again, But at that exact moment, the second intruder, a younger man I didn't recognize, emerged from the shadows and struck him from behind. Blake collapsed, his weapon clattering to the floor. I pushed Dad's wheelchair the final few feet into the hallway, urging Mom ahead of me toward the secure room. Behind us, I heard Malcolm's measured footsteps following, unhurried, confident. "Running only delays our conversation, James." His voice echoed down the hallway. "And I've been waiting so very long for this moment." We reached the secure room, essentially a glorified closet with a reinforced door, and I practically shoved Dad's wheelchair inside, following with Mom and slamming the door behind us. My trembling hands engaged the 3 heavy locks just as Malcolm reached the other side. "Very good, James," he called through the door, his voice unervingly pleasant. "You've protected your parents, just as your father tried to protect you all those years ago. But locks won't keep me out for long." "The police know we're here," I shouted back, trying to keep my voice steady. "They'll be coming." A soft chuckle. "I'm counting on it, actually, but they won't arrive in time for our conversation. Now, let's be civilized about this. Open the door, and I promise your parents won't be harmed." I exchanged glances with Mom, who stood protectively beside Dad's wheelchair. She shook her head slightly, her eyes wide with fear but resolute. "You've killed dozens of innocent women," I called through the door. "Why would I believe any promise you make?" "Because I've never lied to you, James." The sincerity in his voice was somehow more terrifying than any threat. "I could have killed you many times over the past week. At your office, at your home, even at the county records building. But that was never my intention." "Then what do you want?" "Understanding, recognition, for someone to appreciate the scope of my life's work." Pause. "Your father suspected, but he couldn't prove anything. Couldn't see the full picture. You, James, you've uncovered what he couldn't. You've seen my legacy." Outside the door, I heard the sound of metal striking metal. Malcolm or his accomplice attempting to disable the locks. The door was solid, but it wouldn't withstand a determined assault for long. Dad tugged at my sleeve, gesturing for me to lean closer. "Satellite phone," he whispered urgently. "Call Reyes." The emergency satellite phone Reyes had given me was in my pocket. I pulled it out, grateful that it was separate from the building's disabled systems. Keeping my voice as low as possible, I dialed Reyes's number. She answered immediately. "Turner? What's happening?" "Malcolm's here," I whispered. "He's broken in with another man. Officer Blake is down, not sure about Morris. We're locked in the secure room, but they're trying to get through the door." "I'm 10 minutes out with a tactical team," she replied, her voice tense but professional. 8 officers. Can you hold that long?" I eyed the door, where the sounds of tampering with the locks continued. "Maybe. He has tools. And a gun. Keep this line open. Don't engage with him." A brief pause. "And James? We found the tunnel. Your father was right. It connects the hidden room to an abandoned storm drain 3 blocks from your parents' house. The revelation would have been vindication under any other circumstances. Now, it was just another piece of the horrifying puzzle that was Malcolm Reed." "Hurry," I urged, and returned the phone to my pocket without disconnecting. The metallic scraping at the door stopped abruptly. "James," Malcolm called, his tone conversational. "Do you know why I chose boots as my signature?" I remained silent, but he continued anyway. "Boots leave impressions, footprints, evidence of passage that remains long after the wearer has gone." Pride crept into his voice. "Each pair I left was a marker, a monument, proof that I had been there, that I had created something lasting." "You're insane," I finally responded, unable to contain my disgust. "You didn't create anything. You destroyed lives, families. No, James. I transformed them, made them eternal. Those women would have lived ordinary, forgettable lives. Now they're part of something greater, a legacy built into the very foundations of this city. His voice took on an almost dreamy quality. Every house where I place them, every foundation that holds them, will stand for generations. Long after I'm gone, my work will remain. The calm rationality with which he described his monstrous acts made my skin crawl. This wasn't the raving of a madman, but the measured philosophy of someone who genuinely believed in the perverse art he had created. Your father understood, I think, Malcolm continued. Not the purpose, perhaps, but the scale, the vision. That's why he was so persistent, why he kept looking when others had given up. He was trying to stop you, I countered, to get justice for your victims. A dismissive noise from the other side of the door. Justice is a small concept for small minds. What I've created transcends justice. It's a statement about permanence in an impermanent world. The methodical work on the locks resumed, more focused now. I heard a faint click as the first lock gave way. 2 more to go, Malcolm announced cheerfully. I do admire your father's persistence, you know. It's a family trait, it seems. You've followed the breadcrumbs I left, uncovered what was meant to stay hidden. That deserves recognition. Another click, the second lock disabled. Only one remained between us and Malcolm Reed. James, Mom whispered urgently. What's the plan when that door opens? We can't just wait here to be killed. Before I could answer, Dad spoke up, his voice stronger and clearer than I'd heard since his stroke. Not kill us. Wants James to join him. The realization hit me with sickening force. The boots Malcolm had left on my desk, for when you follow in your father's footsteps. Not a threat, but an invitation. He didn't want to kill me. He wanted to make me complicit in his legacy. That's right, Robert, Malcolm called through the door, having overheard Dad's words. Your son has the builder's instinct, just like I did. The desire to create something lasting. The third lock clicked. And now we can have our conversation properly, face to face. The door swung open, revealing Malcolm standing in the dim emergency lighting that had finally activated. His revolver pointed casually in our direction. Behind him, I could see his younger accomplice standing guard in the hallway. There, Malcolm said, smiling pleasantly. Isn't this better? I've never enjoyed speaking through doors. His eyes, still unervingly bright despite his age, studied each of us in turn, lingering longest on Dad. Hello, Robert. It's been a long time. You're not looking well. Dad glared back at him defiantly from his wheelchair. Murderer, he managed, the word perfectly clear. Malcolm shrugged, unperturbed by the accusation. I prefer artist, but perceptions vary. He turned his attention to me. James, I've been following your career with interest. Turner Construction has struggled since your father's incapacitation. But you've persevered, kept building, creating. What do you want? I demanded, positioning myself subtly between him and my parents. Why are you doing this? I told you understanding. Recognition. He gestured with the revolver toward the hallway. Let's continue this in the main room. More comfortable for everyone. We had little choice but to comply. I wheeled Dad out into the hallway, Mom following close behind. Malcolm and his accomplice escorted us to the main area where Officer Blake lay unconscious or worse on the floor. Of Officer Morris there was no sign. Sit, Malcolm directed, indicating the chairs around the small table. Please. We sat, Mom beside Dad's wheelchair, me across from Malcolm. His accomplice remained standing, watching the exterior door, the young man's face a mask of nervous tension that contrasted sharply with Malcolm's relaxed demeanor. Time is short, Malcolm continued, laying the revolver on the table within easy reach. So I'll be direct. James, I've chosen you to be the caretaker of my legacy. The one who understands the full scope of what I've created. I'll never protect what you've done, I spat. I've helped the police find your victims. I'll make sure every last one is recovered, identified, returned to their families for proper burial. He waved a hand dismissively. That's the surface level, the physical remains. I'm talking about the true legacy. The concept. The transformation of the mundane into the eternal. His eyes took on a feverish gleam. How many builders can say their work contains such depth of meaning? Such layers of significance? You're talking about murder like it's art, Mom interjected, her voice steady despite her evident fear. Those were human beings with lives, families, dreams. Malcolm regarded her with something like pity. Of course they were. That's what gave the work its power. Ordinary lives transformed into something extraordinary. Something lasting. You're insane, I said flatly. Visionaries are often labeled as such by those who lack imagination. He leaned forward. But you're different, James. You've seen the pattern. Recognized the craftsmanship. That's why you're the perfect curator for what comes next. And what exactly is that? Malcolm smiled, the expression chilling in its genuine warmth. Revelation. After decades of working in secret, it's time for my achievement to be acknowledged. He glanced at his watch. The police will be here soon. Detective Reyes and her tactical team, I presume? The casual mention of Reyes froze my blood. How could he know she was coming? Unless... You wanted to be caught, I realized aloud. This whole time, the notes, the threats leading the police to your victims. You wanted to be found, not caught. Recognized. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction at my understanding. The greatest artists are rarely appreciated in their lifetime. But I've had the luxury of a long career, and now I want credit for my work. You won't get away with this, Mom said. There are officers coming. You'll spend the rest of your life in prison. Malcolm nodded agreeably. Almost certainly. But my work will outlive me. Every discovery, every excavation, every news report, they all ensure my legacy will endure. And James will help with that. I'll do everything possible to erase what you've done, I countered. To make sure you're remembered only as a monster, not an artist. You say that now, but you'll come to appreciate the craftsmanship, the dedication required. He gestured toward Dad. Your father did in his way. He recognized the pattern, the signature elements. He knew it wasn't random killing but something designed. Dad's face contorted with rage, his damaged brain struggling to express his loathing. Never understood. Just knew you were evil. Not evil, Robert. Beyond conventional morality. Operating on a different plane of significance. Malcolm turned back to me. That's what I'm offering you, James. The chance to transcend the ordinary. To be part of something greater. In the distance, I heard the faint wail of sirens. Malcolm heard them too, nodding as if they were right on schedule. They'll be here soon, he observed calmly. Which means our time grows short. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small wooden box, placing it on the table. This is for you, James. A token of succession. I made no move to take it. What is it? Open it and see. Against my better judgment, curiosity compelled me to reach for the box. It was heavier than it looked, crafted from polished walnut with a small brass latch. I hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in dark blue velvet, lay a miniature pair of work boots carved from some dark wood, identical to the one left during the break-in at my house. Beside them was a key, old, heavy, ornate. What is this? I asked, unable to keep the disgust from my voice. The key opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank, downtown branch. In it you'll find complete records of all my work, locations, names, dates. Everything the police haven't discovered yet. Malcolm's expression was serene, almost beatific. There are more sites, James. Many more. Some they'll find eventually through their investigation. Others they never would without this information. I stared at him, trying to process what he was offering. Why would you give me this? Why now? Because it's time. My work is complete. The circle is closed. He glanced meaningfully at Dad. And because someone needs to understand the full scope, the complete vision, the police will see only crimes to solve. You, James, you have the capacity to see beyond that, to grasp the architectural significance. The sirens were growing louder now. Malcolm's accomplice shifted nervously by the door. They're coming, the younger man warned, his voice tight with anxiety. We need to leave. Malcolm waved him off without looking away from me. There's nowhere to go, Timothy. This is the endgame we discussed. To me, he added, my nephew. The only family member who showed any interest in my hobby, though he lacks the true artist's temperament. You said we'd have a way out, Timothy protested, panic rising in his voice. You promised. And so we do. Malcolm finally turned to him. Just not the kind you were expecting. Before anyone could react, Malcolm grabbed the revolver from the table and fired a single shot. Timothy collapsed, a look of shocked betrayal frozen on his face as blood bloomed across his chest. Mom screamed. Dad jerked in his wheelchair. I lunged across the table, trying to wrest the gun from Malcolm, but he was surprisingly strong for his age. We struggled briefly before he broke free, backing away with the revolver still firmly in his grasp. That was unnecessary, he said calmly, straightening his rain-dampened shirt. I have no intention of harming you or your parents, James. I told you you're the caretaker now. The curator. You're a monster, I spat, glancing desperately toward the fallen officer by the door, wondering if his weapon was within reach. Visionary, Malcolm corrected. And now, with the police moments away, we've reached the final act. He gestured toward the wooden box with the gun. That information is my gift to you. What you do with it is your choice. But I suspect, given time, you'll come to appreciate the artistry behind it all. The sirens were very close now, multiple vehicles by the sound of it. Malcolm walked calmly to the door, peering out into the storm-lashed night. Perfect timing, he murmured, then turned back to us. This is goodbye, James. Remember what I've taught you about foundations. They support everything that comes after. They're the hidden strength beneath the visible structure. He stepped outside into the rain, the revolver held loosely at his side. Through the open door, I could see police lights strobing through the darkness, illuminating Malcolm's figure as he walked deliberately toward them. Police, drop your weapon, a voice commanded through a megaphone. Drop your weapon and get on the ground? Malcolm kept walking, revolver still in hand. I knew what was coming, what he had planned all along. His final act, his grand finale. Stop, I shouted, running to the doorway. Malcolm stopped, but he had no intention of stopping. As officers emerged from their vehicles, weapons trained on him, Malcolm raised the revolver not toward the police, but to his own temple. Remember the foundations, James, he called, his voice carrying clearly through the rain. Remember what lies beneath. The gunshot was lost in a crack of thunder, but I saw him fall, saw the officers rush forward, too late to prevent what Malcolm had orchestrated from the beginning, his final transformation from hid end killer to public spectacle, from shadow to spotlight. I stood in the doorway, rain soaking me as Detective Reyes sprinted from her vehicle toward the building. Behind me, Mom was calling my name, her voice distant through the ringing in my ears. My eyes remained fixed on Malcolm's crumpled form, on the growing pool that mingled rain and blood, washing away into the saturated earth beneath him. The aftermath unfolded in a blur of police statements, evidence collection, and media frenzy. Malcolm Reed's dramatic end became international news, his decades of killings earning him the gruesome moniker, the Foundation Killer, in breathless headlines. The wooden box and the key it contained led investigators to the safe deposit box, where they found exactly what Malcolm had promised, detailed records of over 30 killings spanning nearly 50 years. Dad's health improved remarkably in the weeks that followed, as if the resolution of his decades-long suspicions had lifted some invisible burden. His speech became clearer, his movements more coordinated. The doctors called it unexpected but not unheard of in stroke recovery, a sudden breakthrough after months of plateau. He needed closure, Mom explained to a surprised neurologist. He needed to be proven right. Turner Construction faced a difficult path forward. The Eastwick development was permanently canceled, the land eventually sold to the city for a memorial park honoring Malcolm's victims. Our other projects continued, though some clients quietly took their business elsewhere, unwilling to be associated with a company now linked to one of the country's most prolific serial killers. But we survived. In time, the media attention faded. New contracts came in, often from families of victims who wanted to support the company that had helped bring Malcolm to justice. Dad, though retired, began consulting occasionally, his experience and insights valued even through his still halting speech. As for my parents' house, the house I'd grown up in, the house with the hidden room beneath the utility floor, we sold it. Not because we couldn't bear to return, though that was partly true, but because it was time. Dad insisted that we donate the proceeds to a foundation established for the victims' families, and we did. The hidden room was sealed permanently after the police completed their investigation. The tunnel Malcolm had created, an impressive feat of clandestine engineering that connected to an abandoned storm drain 3 blocks away, was filled with concrete. The house's dark secret was disclosed to the new owners, a young couple who spoke of reclaiming the space from darkness. I wished them well but never visited. 1 year after Malcolm's death, I found myself standing at the edge of a newly poured foundation for a community center in East Haven. Turner Construction had won the contract against steep competition, our first major project since the Eastwick development had been canceled. The concrete was still wet, smooth, and gray in the late afternoon sun. Detective Reyes, Elena, as I'd come to call her during our continued friendship, stood beside me, watching the workers finish the edges. "How does it feel?" she asked quietly. "Building again." I considered the question, my eyes on the wet concrete that would soon harden into permanence. Different. Every foundation I pour, I think of him. Of what he did, what he hid. That's natural. It may never completely go away. I know. I turned to face her. But that's not entirely bad. It makes me more conscious of what we're creating, of the responsibility that comes with building something lasting. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. Over the past year, as the full scope of Malcolm's crimes had been uncovered, we developed a bond forged in shared trauma and recovery. Not quite romance, but something with potential to become more when the shadows weren't quite so fresh. "Your father asked me something interesting yesterday," she said as we walked back toward my truck. "He wanted to know if I thought Malcolm had succeeded." Succeeded? In what way? In creating a lasting legacy. In being remembered. She glanced at me. I told him that Malcolm would be remembered, but not in the way he wanted. Not as an artist or visionary, but as a study in human depravity. A cautionary tale? I thought about this as we drove back to the office. Malcolm had wanted recognition, had orchestrated his own dramatic end to ensure maximum publicity for his work. But history would remember him as a monster, not the artist he fancied himself to be. Yet in a perverse way, he had achieved a kind of immortality. His name would appear in criminology textbooks. Documentaries would analyze his methods. And beneath dozens of houses across the city, the physical evidence of his madness remained, impossible to fully eradicate without destroying the buildings above. That night, I dreamed of foundations. Not nightmares of bodies or boots half buried in soil, but ordinary concrete slabs, clean, solid, supporting structures where people lived their lives in safety and comfort. In the dream, I was inspecting each foundation carefully, ensuring its integrity, its ability to bear the weight placed upon it. I woke feeling rested for the first time in months. 5 years passed. Turner Construction not only survived but thrived, eventually expanding beyond our city to take on projects throughout the state. Dad's health stabilized. He would never fully recover from the stroke, but he regained enough function to enjoy his retirement, to play with the grandchildren Elena and I gave him, to see the company he built continue under my stewardship. The Foundation Killer case faded from headlines to occasional retrospectives, true crime podcasts, and a mediocre streaming documentary that got most of the details wrong. All but 3 of Malcolm's victims were eventually identified and returned to their families for proper burial. The memorial park at the former Eastwick site became a place of quiet reflection, with 33 benches arranged in a circle, 1 for each confirmed victim and 3 for those who remained nameless. I visited occasionally, sitting on different benches, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes just sitting in silence. Not out of morbid fascination, but from a sense of responsibility, a keeper of memory, ensuring that these women were remembered for who they had been in life, not just as Malcolm Reed's victims. On the 5th anniversary of Malcolm's death, I found myself driving to Lake Merritt, to the site where his hunting cabin had once stood. The property had been sold again, the cabin demolished and replaced with a modern vacation home that sat empty most of the year. I parked on the public access road and walked the shoreline, wondering what had drawn Malcolm to this place. The lake was beautiful in the autumn light, water rippling gold and crimson with reflected foliage. A peaceful place far removed from the horrors he had created. Had he come here between killings to reflect, to plan, to record his acts in that leather-bound journal? Or had it simply been a refuge, a place where he could pretend to be normal? As I walked back to my car, a glint of something metallic caught my eye in the soil near the water's edge. Curious, I knelt and brushed away the dirt to reveal the heel of a work boot, the leather long rotted away but the metal components still intact. My blood ran cold. I looked around frantically, half expecting to see Malcolm watching from the trees, before remembering that he was 5 years dead. His ashes scattered by court order to prevent any gravesite from becoming a macabre pilgrimage destination for the morbidly curious. With shaking hands, I called Elena. "We need to search the shoreline," I told her when she answered. "The whole lake. I think there are more." She arrived with a team an hour later. The search lasted 3 days and uncovered the remains of 4 more women buried along the shoreline, victims Malcolm had never documented, never included in his meticulous records. Perhaps his earliest experiments before he developed his signature method of burial beneath foundations. Or perhaps those he considered failures unworthy of inclusion in his twisted catalog. That night, after the last of the remains had been carefully excavated and transported to the medical examiner's office, Elena and I sat on our back porch watching our 3-year-old daughter play with building blocks on a blanket at our feet. "Do you think we'll ever find them all?" I asked quietly. "All his victims?" She sighed, her hand finding mine in the gathering dusk. "Probably not. Men like Reed, they're full of secrets. Some they take to the grave." Our daughter looked up at that moment, proudly displaying a tower of blocks she'd constructed. "Look, Daddy. I built it." "Built," I corrected gently. "You built it. And it's wonderful, sweetheart." She beamed, then deliberately knocked the tower over, laughing with the pure joy that only children can find in destruction. Immediately, she began rebuilding, humming to herself. "That's the difference," Elena said, watching our daughter, "between what you do and what he did. You build to create spaces for life. He built to conceal death." I nodded, the simple truth of it settling something that had been restless within me for years. "The foundations matter," I said, thinking of the dream I'd had years before. "What we build upon matters." Later that night, after Elena and our daughter were asleep, I sat in my home office reviewing plans for a new project, a women's shelter being built on land donated by the city. Turner Construction had taken on the job at cost, our contribution to a community still healing from Malcolm's legacy of terror. As I studied the foundation specifications, I realized I was no longer haunted by thoughts of what might be concealed beneath. Instead, I focused on strength, on durability, on creating something that would support and protect for generations to come. The boots Malcolm had left me, both the actual pair on my desk and the carved miniature in the wooden box, were evidence now, sealed away in police storage. Yet their symbolism lingered, not as he had intended, not as markers of his perverse art, but as reminders of the path not taken, the legacy rejected. I closed the blueprints and turned out the light. In the darkness, I thought of all the foundations yet to be poured, all the structures yet to be built, the weight they would bear, the lives they would shelter. And I made a silent promise to those lived and those yet to come. The foundations I laid would support only life, never conceal death. They would be clean, solid, honest in their purpose. They would bear no hidden footprints, hold no shadowed secrets. That night, I slept without dreaming of Malcolm Reed for the first time since discovering the bodies at the Eastwick site. Instead, I dreamed of my daughter building her block towers, knocking them down, building them again. Creating, destroying, creating anew. The natural cycle unperturbed by darkness. 10 years after Malcolm's death, I received a package at my office. No return address, postmarked from a city across the state. Inside was a single item, a miniature work boot carved from pale wood, nearly identical to the ones in Malcolm's wooden box. With it was a note containing just 3 words, "Remember the foundations." My hands trembled as I set the boot down, memories flooding back, Malcolm's voice in the rain, his final words before he took his own life. I called Elena immediately, and within hours the package was being processed for evidence, the boot examined for fingerprints or DNA. Nothing conclusive was found. The boot appeared to be recently carved, though it's still fresh. The note was printed from a standard inkjet printer on common paper available at any office supply store. The postmark provided the only lead, a small city about 3 hours away. Could Malcolm have had an accomplice? I asked Elena as we sat in her office, the boot now sealed in an evidence bag between us. Besides his nephew? It's possible, she admitted. We always wondered how he managed some of the more complex burials alone. And there were a few timeline inconsistencies we never fully resolved. Or a protege. Someone he mentored or influenced. Also possible. We know he maintained correspondence with several true crime enthusiasts while in hiding. He enjoyed the attention. She tapped the evidence bag. But this could also be a simple hoax. Someone who followed the case and wanted to stir up trouble. I nodded, but the dread that had settled in my stomach didn't ease. I should be prepared either way. Elena's team investigated, visiting the city where the package had been mailed, interviewing postal workers, checking security cameras. They found nothing conclusive. The trail went cold. Life continued. Our daughter grew. Turner Construction expanded further, opening offices in 2 neighboring states. Dad's health declined again, but gently this time, the natural progression of age rather than sudden catastrophe. Mom cared for him with unwavering devotion, and when he finally passed, 7 years after Malcolm's death, it was peacefully in his sleep. At the funeral, I spoke of his legacy, not just the company he built, but the persistence with which he had sought justice, even when no one believed him. How he had recognized evil and refused to look away, refused to accept convenient explanations or comfortable lies. My father taught me that foundations matter, I told the gathered mourners. That what we build upon shapes everything that follows. His foundation was one of integrity, of truth, of refusing to ignore wrongdoing even when confronting it came at great personal cost. After the service, as guests mingled at the reception, an elderly woman approached me, familiar somehow, though I couldn't immediately place her. "James," she said, taking my hand in both of hers. "You won't remember me. I'm Marion Delahunt." Recognition dawned. My parents' former neighbor from Millfield, the woman who had witnessed Malcolm's nighttime activities during construction. "Of course, Mrs. Delahunt. Thank you for coming. It means a lot. Your father was a good man. One of the few who saw the truth back then." Her eyes, magnified by thick glasses, held mine. "But evil doesn't die easily. It finds new vessels." A chill ran through me at her words. "What do you mean?" She glanced around, then leaned closer. "I've kept in touch with happenings in Millfield over the years. The Patterson's house, 220 Cedar Street, where I saw Malcolm that night, it sold recently. To a young man. A builder. That's not unusual, Mrs. Delahunt. Houses change hands all the time. He's renovating the foundation," she continued as if I hadn't spoken. "Expanding the crawl space. Working nights mostly. Alone." I struggled to maintain my composure. "Have you reported this to the police?" "And tell them what? That a homeowner is doing renovations? That I'm an old woman with suspicions based on events from 50 years ago?" She shook her head. "They wouldn't listen. But you would. Your father would have." I promised to look into it, more to calm her than anything else. But after the funeral, I found myself driving past 220 Cedar Street, slowing as I approached the familiar house. A contractor's van sat in the driveway, Reed Renovations painted on its side in fresh green lettering. My blood turned to ice. I pulled over, staring at the van, at the house, at the man who emerged from the front door carrying tools. Young, perhaps 30, with the same lean build as Malcolm, the same deliberate way of moving. He looked up, sensing my scrutiny, and our eyes met across the distance. He smiled, a genial, neighborly smile that didn't reach his eyes, and waved casually as if we were old acquaintances passing on the street. I drove away, hands shaking on the steering wheel, Malcolm's final words echoing in my mind. "Remember the foundations, James. Remember what lies beneath." Some legacies, it seemed, refused to stay buried. We live with the foundations laid by those who came before us. We build upon them, sometimes unknowingly, carrying forward both their strength and their flaws. And eventually we become foundations ourselves, supporting what comes after, influencing what will be built upon the ground we've prepared. Malcolm Reed sought to create a legacy of horror, a foundation of death supporting the structures of everyday life. He wanted recognition as an artist, a visionary who transformed the mundane into the macabre. In the end, he achieved only infamy, his name a cautionary tale, his work a testament to human depravity rather than creativity. But his influence lingered, like boot prints in wet concrete, impressions that hardened with time, becoming part of the structure itself. His methods inspired imitators. His story fascinated the morbidly curious. His legacy, despite all efforts to eradicate it, endured. I sometimes wonder if we ever truly escape the foundations laid for us. If we can break free from the patterns established before we were born, or if we're destined to build upon what's already there, good or ill. Malcolm believed he was creating something eternal, something that would outlast him. In his twisted way, perhaps he succeeded. But foundations can be excavated. Structures can be demolished and rebuilt. What lies buried can be unearthed, examined, and finally laid to rest properly. That work continues. With each new discovery, each victim identified and returned to their family, each site cleansed of its hidden horror, Malcolm's true legacy diminishes. The darkness he sought to immortalize recedes, replaced by the light of truth, of justice, of closure. And new foundations are laid, stronger, cleaner, bearing the weight of knowledge rather than secrets, supporting structures where life unfolds without shadow, where footprints in the concrete are just footprints, markers of passage, not of predation. I still build. Turner Construction continues my father's legacy of integrity, of quality, of creating spaces where people can live and work in safety. Each foundation we pour is inspected thoroughly, its composition and construction documented meticulously. No secrets, no hidden spaces, no shadows. And if sometimes, standing at the edge of newly poured concrete, I find myself listening for echoes from below, that's my burden to bear, my vigilance, my promise to those who were buried and those who might have been. Remember the foundations, Malcolm had said. Remember what lies beneath. I do remember. I always will. But not as he intended. Not as a celebration of his perverse art, but as a reminder of the responsibility we all bear for what we build, what we hide, what we allow to remain buried. The foundations matter. What we build upon matters. And sometimes, the most important work we can do is to dig up what others have buried, to bring darkness into light, to transform secret horrors into acknowledged truths. That's the legacy I choose to carry forward. Not Malcolm's footprints in the foundation, but my father's persistence in uncovering them. Not concealment, but revelation. Not shadows, but light. As for the young man at 220 Cedar Street with his Reed Renovations van and his foundation work, I watch him. I document his activities. I prepare evidence for the day when suspicion hardens into certainty. And I remember my father's decades-long vigilance, his refusal to look away. Some boots leave deeper impressions than others, but all footprints eventually can be followed back to their source. All foundations eventually can be examined for what they truly contain. That's the work that remains, and I'll continue it as long as necessary, until the last victim is found, the last secret unearthed, the last shadow dispelled, until the foundations are finally clean.
you.